Chapter 1742. Published at 10th of April 2023 11:05 and 14 seconds AM. Chapter 1742. Network. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel shook his head speechlessly. He could tell that this old man was trying to take advantage of him again. But what else was new? First it was the war against terrain, then it was the expansion war that took place after Earth entered the fifth dimension, and now this. It made him wonder how Earth ever managed to survive without him at all. He had only had the badge for a few seconds, but he was already swamped with work. He hadn't even properly recovered yet. Also, did they not see how sickly he looked? Where was the justice in all of this? In the end, though, Lionel still put the badge away and turned to leave. Don't blame me for my methods. Then, Lionel said on his way out. Emperor Fox chuckled in his heart. My only worry is that you won't be wild enough. Even though he thought this, he didn't say it out loud. Empress Fox sighed. Although she was aware that her relationship with Lionel wasn't very close, she still found it unfortunate. He had hardly looked at her despite the fact they hadn't seen each other in over 20 years in her eyes. Oh, right, Lionel turned back. Grandma, this man is very shameless. If you bullies you be sure to call me so I can teach him a lesson. He's apparently got too much free time on his hands since he wants to run my empire into the ground. The Empress was shocked speechless for a moment before she sputtered with laughter. Her gaze filled with a doting and loving expression. Even after just a few seconds, Lionel could tell that his grandparents' relationship was a lot different than his own with Anus, or even that of his parents. Their past should also be quite complex considering how long they had spent separated. Simply put, his grandmother didn't have very sturdy reins on this old man, so it was best that he tightened them for her. For the first time, Emperor Fox's expression flickered with a peculiar light. It was fleeting and almost impossible to pick up on. But the moment Lionel saw it, he grinned wildly. It had been a long time, but he had finally found it. The old man's weakness. Lionel turned back toward the palace's exit, raising his head in laughter. He would have quite some fun pressing down on this weakness in the future. It was too hard to deal with someone who had no shame. There was really only one method, to be even more shameless. The ministers fell into silence. For some reason, after Lionel's appearance, all of the tension had dissipated into thin air. Although the faces of the ministers were all new. They were all citizens of Earth. They were here when Lionel dropped a city on the capital and crushed the demigod that had stripped them all of their ability indexes and left them helpless in the face of terrain's experts. They had all been here when 3 six-dimensional galaxies attacked and Lionel fought 6 six-dimensional experts alone while he had only been at the 5th dimension, crushing them one by one and then out-scheming them in the end. Even though 20 years had passed, and the legends had somewhat faded, if there was anyone who remembered it was them. Prince Lionel Morales had returned. And since he had, these matters could be considered to be settled. It was unknown just how much he had improved in his absence. But they suddenly felt a great amount of anticipation in finding out. Among the ministers, there was a gorgeous woman who sat in silence. This was none other than the former Secretary Marquisette Maya of the Royal Blue Province. However, now, not only was her status high enough to sit within the imperial court, her position didn't seem to be normal even amongst the ministers as well. She watched Lionel's back disappear into the distance, her thoughts unknown. Lionel rubbed little Blackstar's head, lost in thought for a moment. He wasn't exactly sure of how to approach this just yet. He was just one person and the burden was heavy. The obvious choice was to build up a cohort of people that he could trust, preferably one large enough to take up the former role of Shield Cross Stars, but that would take too long. The people he could trust without a shadow of a doubt were far too few. This meant that Lionel's best choice was a small, speedy and tactical unit that could quickly cover the territory of Earth. Unfortunately, even the flagship at its greatest speed would take several hours to cross the 2 furthest points in Earth's territory. If Lionel wasn't fast enough, it would be a problem. Then that means that the only way is to set up a teleportation network, one that allows me to get anywhere within a few minutes. I could probably finish something like that within a week given that I have enough resources. Resources should be fine, they'll just steal from the old man. In these 2 decades, I'm sure that he's accumulated a large amount of wealth, especially with the current range of Earth's territory. In that case, the biggest problem with this approach will be that I won't have enough people to protect these teleportation networks. If others knew of Lionel's thoughts, they would be shocked into silence. If creating a teleportation network was so easy, it wouldn't only be the likes of the Void Palace that had such methods. In fact, even for the Void Palace, they didn't set up networks, but rather relied on high-class treasures they only handed to a select few individuals. This was how Lionel's mother had opened that wormhole-like portal back to the Void Palace. Lionel wanted to do something like this, but his ambitions were further beyond because unlike others, he could see through the limitations of the Void Palace system and he wanted to fix them all. "I need a map of Earth's territory," Lionel mumbled to himself as he turned back, entering the palace once again. The guards could only speechlessly watch him. Maybe only Lionel would so casually come in and out of the Ascension Empire's palace as though he owned the place. Chapter 1743. Published at 10th of April 2023 11:05 and 12 seconds AM. Chapter 1743, Idiot? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. What the fuck is this? Lionel stood in the palace's library, speechlessly going through star charts and not having any idea what to make of them. How could these even be called maps? They might as well have been scribbles. Lionel took a breath and exhaled. This is still alright. They'll just have to merge the knowledge I got from the Void Library with this. It won't be perfect but... Lionel shook his head and began to reconstruct the star charts in his dream world. He was fast and the process only took a few seconds. Although his body looked frail currently, his soul was like a blazing star at its core. His mind was even faster than it had been before, so much so that it didn't even make sense for him to count his number of split minds any longer, and his stamina felt endless. It was certain that this was a product of the cleansing brought through the Emperor's Might Tablet, the largest changes occurring after he assimilated Emperor's command. Arise, definitely not perfect. I'd say that this is probably only about 60 to 70% accurate. Lionel's brow furrowed. The Void Library definitely wasn't the best place to get up-to-date maps. A much better place would probably be the Shield Cross Star's main branch. Although the Void Palace did have some basic information on sectors and galaxies, they tended to be quite out of date, lagging years behind, by now. The problem was obvious. The information the Void Palace had was from back when Earth was still in the third dimension. Since then, Earth had metamorphosized 4 times. And the surrounding territory had changed with it, although the planets would mostly be in the same positions and such. It was hard to tell exactly which planets had shown the greatest potential and were as such targets of larger populations, as they wouldn't necessarily be the planets that had started off as the most powerful. Back when Earth entered the 5th dimension, a whole host of new planets with great potential popped up. The ones with the greatest potential were classified as such and became priority locations to defend during the war. Since then, Earth had undergone 2 evolutions, and while Earth itself still had by far the greatest potential, there were countless other locations that were of great importance and were likely being fought over constantly. Without knowing exactly where these conflicts were, it would make it more difficult for Lionel to decide how to set up the network and make things run more smoothly. After a moment of thought, Lionel's gaze flashed and he thought of a solution. He flipped over his palm and his police badge appeared, flashing and vibrating all the while. With a thought, he sunk his mind into it, and as expected, he found a log of all the calls that had been made since the creation of the badge. He quickly sorted the calls by frequency and then by location. Afterward, he drew circles in his created spots across locations that could be considered hotbeds and ones that were cooler in area. When he was done, he had a systematic representation of where teleportation spots were most needed. Now he just needed exact locations. He had to choose locations for these teleportation spots that would be hard to find, or else if others wanted to cause trouble and destroy them before he could make use of them, that would be too troublesome. Luckily, the number of abandoned planets and moons far outstripped the number that was in active use. It was all too easy for Lionel to find such locations and even set up measures to protect them. That should be enough. It's been a while since I've gone all out in crafting. This should be fun. In reality, it had only been a few weeks since Lionel constructed his new divine armors. It could only be said that he was quite addicted to crafting if these were still his thoughts. After leaving the library, Lionel looted the vaults of the Ascension Empire, taking far more than he needed without batting an eye. Then, he found a random place and entered the segmented cube. Is everything okay? Lionel had only just entered when Aina's voice drifted to his ears. She had, of course, been there as Lionel was slowly losing his temper. She too was enraged. After all, Earth was also her home, so she was worried about it. It should be fine, but that old man suddenly gave us a ton of work the moment we got back. Aina raised an eyebrow. Us? Lionel turned toward Aina and grinned, scooping up her small waist in a single arm. Of course, us. Haven't you ever heard of, in sickness and in health? Aina rolled her eyes, pushing Lionel away. I still don't see a wedding ring. You've gotten too comfortable taking advantage of me. Lionel blinked innocently. Don't you like it when I take advantage of you? Aina's head snapped up, but by then, she only felt a light gust of wind as Lionel disappeared to the lab setting, the echo of his laughter leaving her quite helpless to do anything. Lionel worked fast, feeling the time crunch. Every time he sensed the badge buzz, he felt an added sense of urgency. He became mechanical in his movements, repeating the same actions again and again, but while his soul was exceptionally robust, the weakness of his body was lowering his finger designation and his limbs were having a hard time keeping up. He pressed through it, trying to push past the plateau. Although he doubted that there was anyone who was being brazen enough to start massacres, the situation would only deteriorate from here. If he couldn't rein it in now, things would only become more troublesome in the future. Several hours in, Lionel was already exhausted and reaching his limits. What are you doing? Anastasia's voice sounded. Crafting, Lionel replied, too tired to be as annoyed as he should be by the stupid question. Are you an idiot? Anastasia answered. Chapter 1744. Published at 10th of April 2023 11:05 and 10 seconds AM. Chapter 1744. Short fuse. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel was indeed too tired to be annoyed initially, but when he heard Anastasia, he seemed to be slowly finding the energy. Didn't this floating loli have anything better to do than berate him? He was trying to save lives here. I'm busy, Lionel responded. Busy being an idiot. You know you can use the lab setting to do all those repetitive tasks for you. This is the first time I've seen someone try to mass-produce something personally when they had access to so many machines. Lionel came to a stop and looked toward Anastasia. The latter only looked back at him with a face of disdain. If it wasn't because she was so focused on deducing a path through force manipulation that the majority could use, she would have stopped Lionel ages ago. You only need to craft it once and that thing will do the rest. Anastasia pointed with her head toward a glass chamber that had numerous spider-like arms of metal within. Lionel blinked once before doing as Anastasia said, then he watched in absolute awe as the machine repeated his steps absolutely perfectly. At first he thought there would be a drop in quality. If there was one, it just wouldn't be worth it. However, he soon found that he had been overthinking things, everything he had done. The machine did. Even down to his precise control of force. Seeing this, Lionel exhaled a breath of relief. This was a game changer. He suddenly felt the need to look toward Anastasia. What other things are in here that I don't know about? Lionel asked. Anastasia sneered. Weren't you busy crafting? Lionel coughed lightly. Maybe he was just a bit too cranky. He couldn't help it though. His body felt like it was a gust of wind from keeling over. Also, he felt like a guillotine was looming over his head and ready to fall any time now. He really didn't want to waste even a second, seemingly seeing Lionel's plight. Anastasia rolled her eyes and began to point things out one by one. Not even a few hours later, Lionel walked out of the lab setting with a spatial ring full of crafted items. With everything prepared even faster than he thought, his week-long prediction was cut down to just 3 days, something that made him grin despite his fatigue. You should rest, Aina said, looking up from her meditation. Lionel paused. Aina wasn't wrong, but he really didn't have the time to. But he luckily had a solution to this. It seemed that he had underestimated the segmented cube a bit too much, or more accurately, its abilities were so broken that he found it hard to believe that they all came in one package. He couldn't fathom the kind of existence that had created it. The suspended animation abilities of the segmented cube had evolved to not only stabilize energy and freeze time, but to increase its flow. As well, it was an excellent method of healing up quickly. As long as Lionel went to sleep in one of the pods, he would gain himself several weeks of recovery time in just a few hours. But between that time, he would need to eat. So, he had come to his lovely wife again. Seeing Lionel smile, Aina raised an eyebrow. I just need your help a little, Lionel smiled. After listening to Lionel's explanation, Aina was speechless but still waved her hand and agreed. It wasn't too big of a deal anyway. It was just a wasted day. Maybe only Lionel would be able to make her agree to such a thing. Lionel needed Aina to cook weeks' worth of meals to help him speed up his recovery. He would lie in the suspended animation pods for 15 or so minutes at a time, which would be worth about a day. He would then eat, and then return. Although Lionel could rely on the force of the segmented cube instead, between that and Aina's meals, the choice was obvious. The force pill quality of Aina's meals were far superior to just pumping himself with life force. Not only would he recover faster, but he would come back even stronger than before after putting his body through such a thing. As Lionel prepared, the chaos in Earth's territory only increased. But their day was coming. On day 2, Lionel rose out of the suspended animation pod for the final time, his skin glistening and his hair having returned to its previous shimmering luster. His muscles danced like intertwining steel cords beneath his bronzed skin, pulsing with vitality. Across from him, Aina, who was no small part fatigued, stood with his final meal. Lionel felt a dull ache in his heart when he saw her like this. Normal cooking was one thing, Aina could do that for months at a time without sweating a single bead of sweat, but force pill cooking was on a completely different level. Each meal required a large infusion of force, and Aina had been at it all day. It was no wonder she was so tired. "I'll handle the rest," Lionel said, embracing Aina into a hug. "You can rest for the next few days, I'll get everything set up." Aina nodded faintly, too tired to speak. Lionel soared out of the palace, his black surfboard surging with untold speed as he rushed forward. His sweatpants fluttered in the air, his chiseled torso cutting against the wind as he shot out of the atmosphere. However, to his surprise, there were a large number of Brazinger family members waiting in the skies above, leaving one hint annoyed and another part speechless. It had been an entire day since he came here. Could it be that they were waiting for him? After a while, Lionel realized that this wasn't the case. The Brazinger family members seemed to be patrolling. At that moment, Lionel's temper flared up again. He hadn't seen a single Brazinger family member during his journey to Earth, but he suddenly saw so many of them here. There wasn't a single person who would dare to attack Earth directly, as it would cross the bottom line of the powerhouse families, alliances, and organizations of the human domain. Simply put, there was nothing to defend here. All of the issues were cropping up in the gray areas, regions that had been swallowed up by Earth's world spirits range but had been regions owned by others before. This was the region others could take advantage of under the pretext that it wasn't really Earth. Such regions would benefit from Earth's soon-to-be 8th dimension status and produce resources as such, so they were a hotbed for crime and schemes. And yet, instead of going there to show off their might, they were actually dancing around like clowns here? Lionel's short was exceptionally short recently, and this seemed to want to push him over the edge. Just when Lionel was about to do something, his gaze turned toward the moon. His fragmented Biyao domain lineage factor activated and he zoomed onto its surface, seeing through its details. The moon was a flourishing environment of green and blue, much like Earth, but when Lionel paid attention to what was actually happening on its surface, his heart threatened to erupt into a pool of lava. The moon people, native to Earth, were nowhere to be seen. In fact, he saw nothing but members of those 4 families. Chapter 1745. Published at 10th of April 2023, 11:05 and 9 seconds AM. Chapter 1745. 2 possibilities if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Lionel stood in the skies for a long while, seemingly not even noticing the number of Brazinger family members slowly encircling him, let alone that. He didn't seem to have taken care to mind the sheer number of them that had surrounded his flagship. By this point, they had given up on trying to make it on board and had settled for the next best thing. Waiting for Lionel. As Lionel stood in the skies in silence, a ship just as silently approached, stopping just about 100 or so meters from him. Given the unique rules of space travel and warfare, this distance was actually very close and was about as close as most dared to come without having to worry about other variables. At that distance, it might as well have been the equivalent of someone standing nose to nose with Lionel on the ground. Lionel had slowly calmed from his initial rage. Induced state, there were certain things that he had to be rational about. He didn't actually believe that his grandfather was so useless. This old man was someone even his father spoke of with respect, although this might be in part due to the influence of his mother. Knowing his father's personality, so long as Alienor wasn't within earshot, if he couldn't be bothered to care about Emperor Fox, he would say as much. In addition, even if he was wrong about all of this and his grandfather really was useless. Just a few days ago his mother had threatened Shield Cross Stars into scramming out of their territory with just a single sentence. If the Brazinger family was as fragile as they seemed on the surface, they would have long since been weeded out. If not by his mother, then most definitely by his father. These were the thoughts that kept Lionel rational on the surface and helped him to have a modicum of patience. At the very least, his body wasn't in as poor a state as it was previously, so his fuse was just a bit longer. However, that didn't mean that he would explode any moment now. The spaceship came to a stop, with its size being just about 5 or 6 meters long. It wasn't very large at all. It reminded him a lot of a small yacht, just barely having enough space for some minor luxuries. At that moment, a man stepped out and looked toward Lionel. You are in the airspace of the Brazinger family. Who you are doesn't matter, under the laws set by the Brazinger clan. You will be detained and your assets will be seized. The man clasped his hands behind his back, exuding a strong and mighty aura. For the first time, Lionel looked toward him. Indeed, there was something odd about the Brazinger family. The momentum of this man wasn't any lesser than a disciple of the Void Palace. In fact, his aura was slightly more robust than even Conan of the Leo family, and that was despite seemingly being only at tier 7, of course. This mattered little to the present Lionel, who had defeated Conan with hardly any effort, but it might matter for a future version of himself. Especially considering the fact this man was tasked by the Brazinger family to basically be a glorified guard dog. Something wasn't exactly adding up. Lionel wasn't unfamiliar with the Brazinger family. In fact, he had a deep feud with one of their members, a spectacled young man by the name of Simeon. In truth, the two of them had met 3 times. One ended in a sort of Pyrrhic victory for Lionel where he lost Aina for a span of several months, but both the second and third time, Lionel had directly suppressed him both times. From Lionel's understanding of the situation, Simeon had quite a high status amongst the Brazingers and his ability index was extremely powerful as well. Even beyond that, there was a time where Lionel had met 3 other young men of similar status to Simeon as well, and he had still been able to suppress them all. These matters happened back when Lionel had little understanding of his own personal strength and how to properly implement them. Although he couldn't be said to be perfect now, he was definitely far beyond anything he had been before. Even if his strength regressed back to the point it was back then, so long as he retained his current knowledge, to say that he would easily be at least 10 times stronger was actually a gross underestimation. This was all to say that Simeon hadn't been impressive at all. Of course, his ability index had a great amount of potential, and Lionel had even had thoughts of stealing it using the silver tablet and little black star, as it would be far better in his hands. But the ultimate truth was that Simeon wasn't all that impressive. So the question was, how could someone so clearly unimpressive have such a high status in a family that seemed so mysterious and could apparently afford to use such a talent as a patrol officer? There were only 2 possibilities. The first was that Simeon's status within the Brazinger family wasn't anywhere near as high as Lionel had previously assumed. The second possibility was that for one reason or another, Simeon was unable to display his true abilities. The second possibility wasn't impossible. It had to be remembered that Lionel's mother was similar in a lot of ways. She had spent a very long time in the 6th dimension, more than someone of her talent should, and this was all because Earth's evolutionary status had been a limiter for her. But the moment Earth broke free of the shackles of the 3rd dimension, her potential exploded forth all at once and she became the legend she was today. So has something similar happened with the Brazinger family? But weren't they from Earth as well, so why was the effect so lagging? As Lionel was lost in his thoughts, the man before him seemed to finally realize that he was being overlooked. However, rather than being enraged, he simply raised a hand and pointed it forward. He would just take Lionel down first. Chapter 1746. Published at 10th of April 2023 11:05 and 7 seconds AM. Chapter 1746. Dead if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again, it'll give you one chance. Leave now or it'll kill every last one of you. Lionel suddenly spoke for the first time and a sudden vacuum seemed to form beneath his presence. Every single Brazinger family member suddenly felt that they had been locked onto as Lionel slowly took out his bow. He didn't seem to be in a hurry at all as he knocked a single arrow, closing his eyes as he hovered in the skies. The current state of Lionel's archery was greater than it ever had been before, and it was more than just because of his fragmented bow domain lineage factor or even the improvements to his bow force. It was entirely due to the fact that he was won against using real arrows instead of force-forged arrows. In the past, Lionel couldn't justify spending hours to even days crafting arrows. At best, if he really cared, he might craft one or two that could be used in a pinch as an ultimate sort of trump card, but otherwise, it was better to use bows that had an auxiliary effect of forming bow force arrows. This ultimately weakened his bowmanship somewhat. Many would assume that the bow was the more important part of an archer's arsenal, but there were many schools of thought that treated the arrow as an asset that was just as important. Lionel was of the belief that this was nonsense. But that didn't mean that he didn't understand the kind of deterrence and boost powerful arrows could have. It wasn't just a small boost either. His power as a bowman would easily double. It could only be said that the Brazinger family members who were still readying their charge had no idea what they were getting into. They didn't heed Lionel's words and they would suffer for it. The current Lionel didn't have to painstakingly craft every single arrow. He only had to forge a single one, and now, even while he wasn't paying any attention to it, the segmented cube was mass producing arrows of top-tier quality at a rate he simply couldn't match. As Lionel raised his white lion bow, a resplendent white gold arrow trembled in his fingers, swirling with powerful strands of six-dimensional bow force. At that moment, the head patrol officer who had come to deal with Lionel felt his heart skip a beat, let alone taking Lionel's words seriously. He hadn't even hesitated to move forward with the charge. The back line of spaceships were gearing up their cannons in case they were needed while the frontline spaceships all opened, a flood of patrol officers strapped with flying treasures soaring toward Lionel. However, the moment the head patrol officer met Lionel's cold gaze, a deep sense of regret gripped his heart. Twang! The arrow appeared before his forehead in the blink of an eye, accelerating not just once, but 3 times through the air. Every blast left devastating in its wake, sending shockwaves in all directions and even causing several patrol officers who got too close to its tailwind to explode into a rain of blood, gore and metallic pieces. PCHU. The head of the head patrol officer was pierced through by a hole so tiny and small that it wasn't noticeable at first glance. In fact, for the long while of silence that followed it, it didn't even bleed as though it wasn't there at all. But then, bang! The head patrol's officer's skull seemed to implode. In his final moments, his shock was etched onto his face. But he was entirely incapable of reacting. Just like that, a genius that could have made a name for himself in the Void Palace vanished from the world with a single arrow. By the time all of this had happened, though, Lionel had already knocked another arrow, then another. To say that it was a massacre was an understatement. Lionel didn't even move a single step, nor did he seem to strain or struggle. Every arrow he released, no matter how hard their targets tried to dodge, seemed to end up right at the center of all of their forehead. Charge the cannons. Prepare to fire. The command structure of the Brazingers didn't collapse and another stepped in right away, relaying orders and barking out with their force to protect it. But as soon as they spoke, Lionel's arrow split their head open as well. Lionel flipped his palm and a radiant crimson arrow appeared, etched with ancient and oppressive runes. Even before it was knocked, the temperature of the surroundings seemed to skyrocket, almost as though the sun had suddenly moved an entire half the solar system closer. Die, he said lightly. Lionel knocked and released. The arrow appeared before a spaceship ready to fire in the blink of an eye. It tore through its hull as though it was made of aluminum and then exploded. The skies about Earth and the moon turned blinded as a chain network of fireworks was set off one after another. Lionel didn't show the slightest hint of mercy. In fact, he destroyed their spaceship so thoroughly that even the bits and pieces that survived would burn to ash long before it could fall through Earth's atmosphere and hit the surface. Compared to the boy who struggled to kill a single young girl just 6 years ago, the current Lionel didn't even feel his heart fluctuate. His singular warning was all he cared to give them. Since they didn't listen once, he would send a very clear message. His grandfather had other worries that didn't allow him to act, but he, Lionel Morales, didn't have such scruples. He was already kicked out of the frontier of humanity. He was already a Tier 2 fugitive of the human domain. He was already out of patience. Boom. 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 The flames reflected in Lionel's irises as he watched with a hint of coldness within his gaze. He didn't know how the Brazinger family would react to this, but he hoped it would be foolish. That would give him more than enough reason to slaughter more of them. The debt of his mother-in-law had to be paid somehow. Chapter 1747. Published at 10th of April 2023 11:05 and 6 seconds AM. Chapter 1747. Cost if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Lionel urged his surfboard forward and entered the flagship before shooting off into the distance. He didn't have time to wait for what might come of the aftermath. He would deal with that when he returned. But for now, he had to set up his teleportation network. It wasn't long before Lionel arrived at the first location. It was a barren moon that orbited a planet. That was just as barren. He entered the cave he had decided on, chiseling out a few concealment force arts that could bewilder the mind before following down a network of tunnels and finding a spacious enough location. He couldn't pick a spot that was too secluded or cramped because the teleportation network would work best if it could teleport at least a few dozen people at a time. Obviously, this needed not just a robust capacity on the part of the teleportation formation itself, but also on the space the teleportation platform was within. The surroundings had to be large and sturdy enough to withstand the fluctuations of force and, obviously, the appearance of so many people. Once Lionel found a suitable location, he took out a disc. After finding a method of escaping zones, Lionel felt that the mode of deployment he had used back then could be applied to other things. Back then, he had used a formation plate of sorts etched with runes. Originally, the reason he did that was twofold. First, it allowed him to create a solid foundation for the teleportation, something that was very much needed if he was going to connect the zone and the human domain together, and secondly, it allowed it to be portable. This was very helpful because this meant that Lionel didn't need to waste time finding the perfect area which contained the fluctuations and densities of force he needed. He could just make the area his own. This concept worked exceptionally well with teleportation arrays like this one, as it would allow Lionel to deploy a large network of them exceptionally quickly. This disk that Lionel had created was just one of several thousand that he and the segmented cube had formed. All he needed to do was set it down, anchor it, and then activate it. It would take more time to travel between locations than it would take to create and set up these array plates. The best part was that he could always expand the network in the future. Lionel quickly left and continued to the next destination, and then the next. With the flagship, his speed of movement around the human domain could be considered to be as fast as it got. If not for the sheer number of stops, Lionel could have finished this matter even quicker, but he was insistent on having a teleportation array network that would allow him to reach any location within a few minutes at the worst. 3 days later, Lionel finally made it to the final location and tossed up the disc before exhaling a breath and releasing a large breath of spatial force. He raised up pillars of emulation spatial force before he nodded and slowly walked out. Stepping onto his surfboard, he shot into the air and returned to his flagship. All that was left to do now was to assemble his team, and there was only one group of men that he absolutely had to have by his side. Lionel grinned. He wondered how his brothers were doing. Quite frankly, he was worried for some of them. Arnold had probably ended up sucked into the zone along with the rest and could only hope that he had survived. As for the others, they had been lucky enough to dodge that event. If Arnold had survived, then he was probably still in the Void Palace, and there wasn't much Lionel could do about that. The Void Palace was too large for Lionel to find a single person. So all he could do was make as much noise as he could. And even then, there was the possibility that Arnold had gone out on a mission. Something that was very much possible. The rest of his brothers, though, should be on Earth, or at least within Earth's territory. He would return to Earth first and see if he could find their traces. Lionel could only shake his head. He really did need an information network. But unfortunately, he didn't have one. Lionel looked off toward a certain direction with narrowed eyes. He currently stood at the bow of the flagship while his clones steered it toward his destinations. His main goal in doing this was to witness as much of the happenings of Earth's territory personally as he could, so as to broaden his own horizons. Lionel wasn't particularly close to Earth currently. In fact, he was quite far. The final destination for his teleportation network had been near the edges of Earth's territory, so it was only right. With a thought, Lionel's gaze zoomed into the distance, skipping over thousands of kilometers at a time before he landed on what he was looking for. That woman. She, in the distance, on an asteroid that seemed to have a floating convenience station on its back, a woman dressed in a tight-fitting black suit prowled forward like a cat. If Lionel had been there when Era had framed him and turned him into a fugitive of S.H.I.E.L.D. cross stars, he would have recognized this floating convenience asteroid as a location one came to for more than just refueling one's spaceships and stocking up on food and snacks. However, Lionel wasn't paying attention to that right now. He was rather paying attention to the woman who was about to kill the convenience station attendee. In his life, Lionel had only personally invited 2 people to become one of his generals, both of whom happened to be women. Even now, he sometimes thought about them. Of course, not romantically, but rather in a faint understanding of how unfortunate it was that he didn't manage to bring them to his side. One of them was Kira, but she could only reject him because she apparently had a connection with one of his other cousins. The second one was this woman right here, a woman he had met during his final days in Valiant Heart Mountain, Emna. The current Emna was still within the 5th dimension, but Lionel's gaze couldn't help but narrow watching her moving. He actually felt a hint of danger coming from her. What Lionel didn't know was that a casual remark that he had made over 25 years ago now had led to the creation of one of the most fearsome intelligence networks of the human domain. And this casual remark hadn't been the one he made to Emna. As Lionel was about to receive a pleasant surprise, there was something far less amicable brewing on the opposite side of Earth's territory. News of the Prince of the Ascension Empire slaughtering an entire patrol unit of Brazingers spread like wildfire. In their fury, the Brazingers descended upon Earth. What Lionel didn't know was that this wouldn't be the first time. And what the Brazingers wouldn't want him to know was that the first descent had cost Lionel the lives of his brothers. Chapter 1748. Published at 10th of April 2023 11:04 and 48 seconds AM. Chapter 1748. No wonder if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Lionel watched Emna move. At times she would seem like a prowling cat beast and at other times she would become a sliding shadow. All of her movements were absolutely seamless and flowed from one to the next without the slightest wasted energy. There was only a single person that Lionel had ever seen move like this, and that was the love of his life, Aina. Aina always fought without the slightest bit of wasted energy. This was different from the more restrained style that Lionel had, albeit subtly. Lionel didn't seem to waste any energy on the surface only because he always chose the most efficient route to defeat all of his opponents. But efficiency and no wasted energy didn't necessarily mean the same thing. While the latter always encompassed the former, the vice versa wasn't necessarily true. Aina's battle style was the exact opposite of Lionel's. Always suppressing her enemy with absolute strength and rarely ever holding anything back. However, even so, she never wasted a single strand of energy all the while. This was to say that Aina's method of using her body always managed to put 100% into her strike, her stride, and/or her defense. Much the same way, Emna managed to achieve this as well. That sort of instinctual battle style that always made perfect use of one's bodily strength. Just the fact that Lionel only knew one person like this. And that this person also happened to be the only individual Lionel had met that he felt truly matched him in talent. It was shocking enough to say the least, from Lionel's understanding. Aina's instinct in fighting came from her Brazinger family lineage factor. The Berserk God lineage factor. There was also a chance that it had undergone a slight mutation considering the fact that she was only half Brazinger as opposed to fully Brazinger. A fact of which was at the root of many of the issues she had faced in her life, however. Emna, or rather Emna Basiran, didn't have such a lineage factor as far as Lionel understood. In addition, he knew what her ability index was as well. She had the Blade Affinity Ability Index. And when he last met her, she was at the body as a blade stage which allowed her to use blade forces from any location on her body. It was potentially possible that there wasn't just a single bastard child of the Brazinger family. If Aina's father could step out of the family, there was no saying that others couldn't do it as well. Plus, the fact that she didn't share the Brazinger family name was useless. Aina had always said that she would keep the Brazinger family name until the day they most wanted her to have it, only then would she reject it. This obviously implied that Aina could change her name whenever she pleased. She just didn't want to. Lionel understood her feelings well. Aina was rejected from the family as a child. Her father was ostracized. She was burdened with a curse and her mother was executed. She wanted more than to just slaughter. She wanted them to lower their heads in shame. She wanted them to acknowledge that her mother wasn't as useless as they said she was. She wanted them to feel endless regret in their final moments. This was all to say that just because Emna didn't share the family name, didn't mean that she wasn't a Brazinger, as Lionel was lost in thought. Emna made it to the fat old man and attacked with a flash. Although Lionel could easily save the big-bellied man, or even just alert him to what was happening, he didn't do so. After separating his soul from his body, and especially after infusing the runes of the Emperor's Might lineage factor's core abilities, Lionel's sensitivity toward things had become a lot sharper. Not only could he apply pressure that found its roots in his demeanor and temperament, he could use it to somewhat see through the demeanors and temperaments of others. Lionel hadn't been able to do this in the past. At the very least he couldn't do it with such absolute assurance, but ever since the Emperor's Might tablet brought him along to perfectly grasp its secrets and integrate with his runes as though he had comprehended them all personally, this passive ability of his became far more active while also becoming more enigmatic. This was to say that Lionel could feel that Emna wasn't acting out of maliciousness. She had come here for a purpose and she even felt a faint hostility toward the man. At the same time, the big-bellied man had a shroud of shrewdness and subterfuge around him. These weren't things a person manning a normal gas station should have. It was clear that his identity wasn't as simple as it seemed. While others observing this might feel as though Emna was trying to rob the place. Although the station looked shabby, given its location, there was probably a large deposit of funds on it since it wasn't convenient to move them away given how out of the way this place was. However, Lionel saw an assassin about to execute an assignment they felt was important for reasons beyond the monetary compensation they would receive. Suddenly, Emna pounced, her finger piercing forward and shuttling through the throat of the big-bellied man. As expected, her blade affinity was far more potent than the past. In fact, Lionel's gaze flashed. It was no wonder he felt that she was so dangerous. The big-bellied man grabbed at his throat, roaring in fury. Seventh dimension. Lionel's brows shot up. He had been so focused on Emna that he hadn't properly seen through this big-bellied man. No, it was more like this man seemed to have a method of concealment. Emna immediately retreated as the aura of the big-bellied man descended. Without hesitation, Lionel urged the flagship forward, appearing within the asteroid belt in an instant. Chapter 1749. Published at 10th of April 2023 11:04 and 45 seconds AM. Chapter 1749. Big-bellied man. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The vitality of a seventh dimensional existence was exceptional. Even when the seventh dimensional existence in question had only taken the conventional path to get to their current level of strength. And sometimes especially so. Those that took the conventional path had to temper their bodies twice over, and as such the powerful ones among them would sometimes have this advantage even over those who took the God path. After all, it had to be remembered that not all those who took the conventional path were considered to be weak. Although Emna's strike could be considered enough to kill almost anyone so long as they weren't like Lionel and had their bodies and souls as two separate existences, the problem was how long it would take. A cornered beast was the most dangerous kind of animal, and a seventh-dimensional existence that knew they were going to die was even worse than a cornered beast. Lionel moved fast, but it would still take him 3 seconds to get there, most of the time of which was spent descending from the flagship. Emna realized the problem and retreated immediately, lamenting slightly. But this was already the best that she could do. If she could have aimed for the head instead, she would have done so, but the issue was that the bones of a seventh-dimensional existence were too incredible. Although it looked like she pierced casually through her target's throat, she had actually slipped her blade force through the vulnerable disc of the big-bellied man's spinal cord, making the resistance minimal. And yet, even so, it took her concentrating a great deal of power in her fingertip just to ensure she pierced flesh. It could be said that she was a mad woman. A fifth-dimensional existence assassinating a seventh-dimensional existence may have never happened before in the history of the dimensional verse. And yet here she was about to succeed. but it also seemed that this success would also cost her life. Despite how fast Emna retreated, she could never be faster than a seventh-dimensional existence. The big-bellied man released an infuriated roar, billowing into the skies as though lamenting the fact his life would end like this. Just the wind pressure and sound of the roar alone was enough to burst Emna's eardrums and make her feel as though her brain might turn to slush any moment. Her balance was thrown off and blade force didn't seem to want to respond to her anymore. Her equilibrium was completely out of whack and the perfect efficiency of her movements were thrown out of the window. The big-bellied man smashed a palm downward, to Emna. It looked no different from a descending mountain. Just the momentum alone made her knees buckle. Move. The words suddenly echoed in Emna's mind. It was soft and soothing, and somehow also somewhat familiar, but at the same time, they carried an odd sort of power that gave her clarity of mind. She regained control of her body just enough for her to leap out of the way. But even so, the power of the big-bellied man's swipe was too strong. Just the residual impact alone was enough to send her flying into the distance, coughing up several mouthfuls of blood as she felt her entire body nearly collapse. Her bones shattered. Her inner organs were skewered through, and her eyes rolled into the back of her head. A shuddering seizure rippling through her body. She rebounded against the asteroid's face hundreds of meters away. The big-bellied man snapped his neck toward the direction she flew in, seemingly not feeling the pain of his neck being pierced through at all. He was riding an emotional high as the final seconds of his life ticked by. He bent his knees, leaping over with a fierce momentum. He crossed half the distance in just a single bound as though the convenience station didn't have even artificial gravity. However, if he had been conscious of what just happened, despair would grip his heart. If it wasn't for his vitality rapidly draining away. How could he only just so far? If he was in peak condition, even jumping double the distance to Emna in a single bound would have been easy. Still, in his current state, the big-bellied man didn't care. Gathering up his strength and bounding forward again, he appeared in the skies above Emna, casting a shadow over her. Emna's vision was blurry and she could barely see what was happening. She could vaguely feel that a shadow had appeared above her, but she could only hope that it was the shadow of the person that had just saved her. If it wasn't, she would truly be finished. Unfortunately for Emna, she wasn't so lucky. 3 seconds was just too small a time frame to a seventh-dimensional expert. If they really wanted to, even attacking dozens of times within that span was as easy as breathing. Luckily, Lionel didn't need to catch up entirely, he just had to enter rage to effect change. Lionel, who was speeding over with his jet-black surfboard, suddenly raised a hand. Bouncing in the skies like that and falling through the air put the big-bellied man in a compromised position. Activating his emulation spatial force, Lionel thrust at the back of the falling big-bellied man, throwing him off course from his descent onto Emna. Bang! Lionel activated his starry light domain and flickered forward 3 times, finally catching up and appearing above the big-bellied man. A spear appeared in Lionel's palm and he struck outward with an undeniable momentum. The big-bellied man growled and looked upward to meet the strike, but Lionel's gaze flashed. Emperor's gaze. To Lionel's astonishment, however, the big-bellied man reacted as though nothing had happened as he continued to punch upward. Lionel's pupils constricted. This man had a soul protection treasure, and a very good one at that. Bang! Chapter 1750. Published at 10th of April 2023 11:04 and 42 seconds AM. Chapter 1750. I need information. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel's arm went numb for a moment and he was pushed back into the skies somewhat. However, at the same time, the big-bellied man nearly fell to his knees, his body growing far too weak to handle the impact. Lionel's gaze flashed and he activated his bronze aura immediately. He hadn't done so before because he was reliant on his Emperor's gaze to finish this in one move, but he made a mental note that he would have to be more careful in the future before he urged his surfboard forward again and struck out once more with a fiercer momentum. Bang! This time, the big-bellied man's retort was even weaker than before and he was forced to his knees, his body shuddering as crimson blood so thick it almost looked black fell from the hole in his neck. A ripple of force dissipated along Lionel's bronze aura as he descended once more, swiftly cutting the big-bellied man's head from his neck. Lionel caught the head in his free palm, his gaze somewhat serious. To think that the difficulty in dealing with a man on his last legs would be so great, of course. It was probably also true that this man was quite powerful amongst conventional path seventh-dimensional existences. But even so, he was still losing a large amount of his strength for every breath he took. And yet he still managed to repel Lionel. These soul protection treasures are so well hidden and their auras are so restrained. You'll need to find and analyze the one this man used so I can not only create some in the future, but so that I can also know ahead of time whether a target of mine has such protection or not, if I make that mistake in the future. It'll be more than a little troublesome. It wasn't that Lionel was helpless against soul protection treasures. But if he wanted to bypass them, it would also take more preparation. There were tiers within the abilities of Emperor's Might. Especially for an ability as fundamental as Emperor's Gaze. It was just that the lowest level was the quickest to deploy in a pinch. Lionel hesitated for a moment before tossing the corpse and the head into a snow globe and rushing toward Emna, who was most definitely on her last legs. Emna couldn't see straight and she had no idea that she had been saved. The gap between the fifth and seventh dimension was simply far too vast. But she was lucky that she had Lionel by her side. Lionel pressed his hands together and a large amount of vital star force and life force began to emit from him. Even if he didn't do anything else, just being in the proximity of these six-dimensional forces would be able to bring Emna back from the brink of death. But even so, Lionel still began to draw a force art. This force art was based on the style of Camelot's magic system and it was quite crude since Lionel was formulating it on the spot. But to save a fifth-dimensional existence, it was more than good enough. As Lionel's spell descended, Emna, who was barely conscious, could feel her bones mending and her organs healing at a visible pace. In just a few seconds, her vision had cleared enough to see Lionel standing over, and in just a few more seconds, she felt better than she ever had in her entire life. It was almost like she had been reborn, instinctually. Emna scurried to her feet, realizing that she wasn't dressed very appropriately as the strike had destroyed a lot of her clothing. She crossed an arm over her chest and looked toward Lionel, although she was wary. She still wanted to say her thanks as it was obvious this person had saved her, but just as she was going to, she froze. "It's you?" Lionel smiled lightly. "It seems that you remember me." "That's good, how could I not? You're the reason." Emna trailed off, seemingly realizing that she was about to say something embarrassing. Lionel raised an eyebrow. "I'm the reason?" Emna fidgeted before gritting her teeth and speaking. "You're the reason we've all been working so hard." Lionel blinked, feeling quite speechless. He had a small amount of charm, but it definitely wasn't to the point that a woman he had only spoken to once would dedicate the next 20 years of her life to him just off the back of a single conversation, right? And also, who was this "we"? Seeing that Lionel was confused, Emna felt her heart sink slightly. Although she knew that it was a small chance, she had hoped that Lionel would remember them. There was a bit of strife in their organization and many of the malcontent came from the fact that many didn't believe they should be working so hard for a man they hadn't seen in decades. Some even said he wouldn't even appreciate their efforts and that they should just be working for themselves. Of course, although these hit a sore spot, Emna knew the words were bullshit. Those people just wanted to move the organization toward a more selfish place, forgetting the reason they were established in the first place. However, seeing Lionel's reaction now, it was hard for her to not feel a small hint of resentment and even feel that maybe those people had some merit to their words. Suddenly, Lionel's gaze flashed. "Who is your leader?" Lionel suddenly asked. Emna sighed. Although she was disappointed, Lionel had still saved her life. "Is it Raylion and Hephaestus?" Hearing this, Emna's head snapped up to meet Lionel's gaze, a hint of expectation within them. Seeing her face was all Lionel needed. It seemed that he had been correct. Back then, after Valiant Heart Mountain was attacked by the other organizations of their quadrant, they had been forced to disband. In fact, the only reason their disciples survived and were able to escape was because Lionel came back and held the line for them as they did so. As such, the former top disciple of Valiant Heart Mountain, Raylion, wanted to do something to pay Lionel back. But in his pride, he wasn't willing to join Lionel without anything to give. He wasn't more powerful than Lionel, so he couldn't protect the latter. He wasn't richer than Lionel, nor did he have a stronger background than Lionel, so he couldn't support the latter. But he had still been determined to do something. Before they left, Lionel remembered saying some casual words that he hadn't thought about even once since then. "I need information," Lionel mumbled the same words that he had said back then. "And I need a lot of it." Raylion hadn't stopped after hearing his words back then, but Lionel could still sense the blazing fire of his will. Lionel suddenly smiled. He couldn't be blamed for not seeing through this immediately. From the beginning, Emna wasn't even a member of Valiant Heart Mountain, she was from a rival organization. How could he draw the connection so easily? Emna's eyes glistened like stars. Those words, they were the motto of their organization. How interesting. In that case, what was your mission here? Why did you kill this man? Lionel asked a question that had him feeling curious. Even he couldn't quite deduce what was happening here. Chapter 1751. Published at 10th of April 2023 11:04 and 41 seconds AM. Chapter 1751. Unprecedented. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Ah. Right. Emna looked around but couldn't find the body. After a while, she shook her head. It didn't matter much. The root of the mission wasn't the body at all, rather it was twofold. One aspect was for the sake of an offensive maneuver with defensive underpinnings. The second aspect was for the information that was likely here. This place is a station of shield cross stars. This was a simple sentence. But the instant Lionel heard them, his expression turned serious. This wasn't just because of the words themselves, but it was rather because Emna was so forthright with this information to begin with. He could imagine the amount of effort it would have taken to get this sort of information. And while it seemed that Emna had a good impression of him, likely stemming from their first meeting and her interactions with Raylion and Hephaestus, the fact she could give him such an important piece of information without blinking just went to show how high his place in her heart was. It was an odd feeling. Lionel had gotten very used to running into enemies wherever he went. There was even a point in time where he felt that maybe he had overestimated his charisma in the past. Why else could he not seem to make any friends in the dimensional verse? However, Lionel made a mistake a lot of successful people, or just people in general, really. He focused a lot on the bad and didn't spend a lot of time looking toward his back view. While there was a trail of devastation in his wake, there was also a lot of good that he had done. He hadn't seen the light of hope in the eyes of Earth's ministers just a few days ago when he returned. He hadn't seen the joy in the eyes of the citizens of the Ascension Empire when they had heard of his return. He hadn't experienced the relief they felt when he massacred the Brazinger family members in the skies. And these were just the people of Earth. There were still the remaining members of Valiant Heart Mountain whose lives he had saved. And there was still Emna, who had seen him single-handedly take on the Milky Way Guild that day. There were still the Cataclysm Generation geniuses of the Void Palace who appreciated his helping them escape the Rapak's nest. There was still Simona, who cried when he returned to her beast partner. And there would still come a day where the disciples of the Void Palace learned that it was under his actions that their lives had been saved. There would always be people who didn't appreciate his efforts. But not every person could ignore their conscience so easily. There was bad in the world, but there was often good to be found as well, even if the latter was on a smaller scale. Emna had no idea that her simple words had made Lionel smile from the depths of his heart for the first time in a long while. Emna was so caught off guard by the genuine smile that she froze, forgetting the next words that she was going to speak. It took her a long time to recover, and by the time she realized that she had made such a mistake, she could only blush down to her chest. If the others of their organization could see Emna now, they would probably be stunned speechless. This cold beauty actually knew how to blush? Emna didn't really know what was happening at the moment either. It was just that she felt this sort of overwhelming magnetism coming from Lionel, one that even she could resist. For a moment, she even thought that it would be worthwhile to die for this man. What was the most shocking, though, was that unlike other charm techniques, not only was Emna hyper-aware of this feeling, she didn't even feel any rejection toward it. Despite being aware that there had to be something odd going on, she still didn't feel fear or disgust. It was an incredibly odd feeling. This was what the four great families feared the most. It wasn't Emperor's aura. Nor was it Emperor's gaze. Nor was it any of the Emperor's commandments. It was Emperor's charm. Emperor's charm wasn't a technique of Emperor's might. Rather, It was a passive skill that took root as the soul of the wielder of Emperor's might was continuously cleansed and refined beneath the Emperor runes. The more clear and refined the soul became, the more influence the emotions of the Emperor would have on the world around them. When the Emperor smiled, the stars would sing. When the Emperor was furious, the skies would sunder. Just now, Lionel felt genuinely happy, a happiness that originated from the depths of his soul. Because of his genuineness, the clarity of his soul influenced Emna. If Emperor's charm was in the hands of a scheming individual who hid their thoughts or never allowed themselves to feel genuine emotion, it wasn't too big of a deal. However, if it was in the hands of someone with true charisma, someone who truly cared for the lives of those around him to the point that he would find happiness in just a simple action, that would be the true Emperor's might. That was what the four great families feared the most. Most of the time, Lionel's true thoughts hid behind a veil of logic and reasoning. But when they shone through, they shone fiercer than most. When he was enraged, nothing else mattered. When he was happy, he would smile, grin and joke. And often, because he only rarely allowed himself to feel such things, when they did occur, they were far more potent than the emotions of others. It could be said without a doubt that in the hands of Lionel, Emperor's charm would unleash an astonishing might. And, after he had already assimilated one of the three supreme skills of Emperor's might, the clarity of Lionel's soul was unprecedented. Chapter 1752. Published at 10th of April 2023 11:04 and 38 seconds AM. Chapter 1752, so. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel seemed to realize what happened and retracted his aura, allowing Emna to finally breathe a sigh of relief. If that feeling was persistent, she had no idea how she would even speak with Lionel for an extended period of time. Her heart might beat out of her chest before she could finish a single sentence. Right. Emna shook her head, not daring to look into Lionel's eyes. This station is under the jurisdiction of Shield Cross Stars. As an organization, they're capable of gathering up a large amount of information, and it's difficult to pin them down on anything. Even after they retreated from Earth's territory, their hooks are still deeply embedded. The goal of this mission was to catch them off guard and maybe see if we can find any clues about finding other stations like this one, after our merger with the former Milky Way Guild. We gained a lot of the information they had on hand and benefited from it. Amongst that information were some of the stations they had been able to unearth over several centuries. But even so, there were only 3. Lionel's gaze flickered. For a long while, the Milky Way Guild had had a monopoly on Earth's home galaxy, but due to this, it was also a convenient target for outside influences. Due to this, Era's father found himself constantly dealing with power struggles. However, it was also due to this that the former guild head had gained a great amount of opportunities as well. The last time Lionel had seen guild head Ovaltine, the latter had just broken into the 6th dimension and turned the tables on the Radix, Midas, Rain, Flora and Umbra families. But it seemed that his schemes ran deeper than even this, considering he knew of a station that existed so far away from the Milky Way galaxy. I see. But isn't Shield Cross Stars the police force of the human domain? Why do you want to target their influence? If the higher-ups of Shield Cross Stars knew that Lionel had actually spoken such words, they might truly cough up blood and fury. Since when did Lionel have respect for Shield Cross Stars and its work? He actually had the cheek to say such a thing while one of their stolen ships loomed over his head. Emna seemed to know that Lionel just wanted to hear her answer. After all, they had already gotten news that Shield Cross Stars was being kicked out of Earth's territory. So how could they be unaware of the events leading up to it? It could only be said that this organization a few words of Lionel's had helped to form wasn't nothing short of impressive. They've been abusing their power for a long time. But it's never been a systemic issue. It was mostly just a few corrupt officers here and there, taking advantage of their station. However, in just the last few days, things have gone from a few bad apples to becoming something far more sinister. Lionel's gaze narrowed. According to our intel, of 10 incidents creeping up in our territory, at least 8 of them are as a direct result of SCS's interference, although none of it is obvious. Their fingerprints are all over the place, and we were able to find out using these 3 unearthed stations as observation points. after we realized what was happening. There was some discussion about which steps to take next. But we were undecided on what to do, with only 3 observation points. There were too many other potential variables, and even our 8 out of 10 assessment was just an extrapolation without solid evidence. So, Emna felt a bit embarrassed when she got to this point in the story. The reality was that she didn't have authorization to come here. Although the idea of her coming had been floated, most had decided that it was far too dangerous. The most powerful individual of their organization was still Guild Head Ovaltine, but even after 20 years, he was still in the 6th dimension, and there was simply no way for him to against a 7th dimensional existence head-on. Emna, with her abilities, probably had the best chance. But, once again, it was far too dangerous. In fact, if not for Lionel's sudden appearance, she would have already lost her life. Just the residual shockwave from a weakened 7th dimensional expert's infuriated strike had left her in a half-dead state and not far from the jaws of death. It was even more accurate to say that she really had died, as she had suffered fatal damage. Just a few more seconds and she wouldn't have been able to hold on any longer. This was all to say that Emna had actually acted on her own, not liking the stalemate they had reached. The internal strife and voices of dissension were getting louder every day, and the original members needed a way to solidify their prestige once again, and the best method to do so would be to prove that Emna could assassinate even a 7th dimensional existence. If she had succeeded, how many would still dare to talk so much? Even without Emna saying it out loud, just by her demeanor, Lionel could guess most of it. Either way, now that we've succeeded, this is a good opportunity. We can scan the base and see if we can find any information that might help with finding out more news. Lionel nodded. He was on a time crunch right now, as there were at least 3 separate incidents that needed to be shut down as soon as possible, but this matter was very important as well. Without Shield Cross Star's backing, there would be much fewer flare-ups. Let's take a look, then. Lionel and Emna made their way and began to search the convenience station. However, even after several minutes and the use of his starry spirit domain, Lionel couldn't seem to find anything. Chapter 1753. Published at 10th of April 2023, 11:04 and 35 seconds AM. Chapter 1753. Impressed. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Emna didn't know that there was nothing to find yet. To her, it had only been a few minutes, and she had no idea that Lionel was capable of enveloping the entire asteroid, even to the point of penetrating to its core. In fact, the fact Lionel had spent a few minutes on this task at all just went to show how thorough he had been. In reality, he already knew that there was nothing to find after a single instant. There has to be something here. Lionel thought that it might be hidden on the corpse itself, but he had already scanned the corpse at all and there was nothing to be found. Not even the slightest mark of shield cross stars was present. There was simply nothing. Lionel felt that he had to think outside of the box. The instant he shifted his perspective, something suddenly clicked. With large strides, Lionel crossed the convenience station and entered its outhouse. It was just a small box barely 2 meters tall. Just to step into it, Lionel had to duck, and the smell was absolutely horrid. There was nothing in this place aside from a hole in the ground and a single phone. Lionel snapped his fingers and with a whoosh, a blinding golden light cleansed everything, and he picked up the phone that looked as though it had come right out of Earth's 19th century. After a moment, Lionel's expression flickered and he placed the phone back down. There were 3 mechanisms on the phone, each one more layered than the last, and they were all exceptionally well hidden. The first allowed it to function as a normal communication device. The second was a diversion tactic that scattered the signal and made it difficult to trace. The third was the real communication network, connecting this phone to a very specific subset of other phones. Lionel's hand formed a clawing motion and ripped the phone from the walls of the outhouse. He had to carefully analyze this himself, or he could hand it over the segmented cube to do. Regardless of the choice, it required the utmost amount of secrecy. Stepping out of the outhouse, Lionel looked into the distance to find that Emna was still looking. He observed her for a moment, shaking his head. She was truly an anomaly. She reminded Lionel a lot of a term that he hadn't heard in a very long time: a spark. A spark was a genius who would become the starting flare to a powerful lineage. The accomplishments of their future influenced their abilities in the present, creating a feedback loop that made them even more powerful than should be possible. What was common within sparks, though, was that they didn't have the backing of powerful families or organizations. In the beginning of his journey, Lionel had been mistaken for a spark many times before, but for obvious reasons. Ever since he entered the Void Palace and became a second-generation wastrel, no one had accused him of such a thing again. Emna, though, was different. Lionel had already realized why she felt so threatening. Her blade affinity ability index allowed her to use her body as a blade, and she had pushed this to the very pinnacle of the 4th tier, but beyond that, she had gone from being able to turn her body into a blade to being able to turn her blades into her body. This seemed like a simple reversal. But the truth was that this was a huge change. In fact, it was enough to call this a mutation of the ability index. In fact, Lionel felt that Emna had already taken the step toward turning her ability index into an incredibly powerful lineage factor. The current Emna had control over 6th-dimensional blade force, not 5th, setting aside just how rare it was to comprehend a weapon force beyond your dimension. If Lionel was correct, she was using this blade force to reconstruct her body. If the Morales family had a body of metal, Emna was creating a lineage factor that forged her body of blade force. Due to this, she was able to break free of the usual restrictions of her dimensional tier, meaning that she had already stepped onto her own path. In fact, it was even more exaggerated than just this. Lionel had a feeling that the reason Emna hadn't stepped into the 6th dimension wasn't because she couldn't, but rather because she was subconsciously aware that if she did so, she would lose this opportunity forever. If Emna managed to perfect her self-created lineage factor before entering the 6th dimension, she would create a path separate from the God and conventional paths. And because this path was created by her own hands, her strength would be almost unprecedented. If Emna's path were to be boiled down into a few words, she wouldn't have to worry about anything outside of improving her blade. As her blade improved, so would she. Once she perfected this lineage factor, her dimensional level would be decided by her blade force level. It was no wonder Emna had such perfect and efficient control over her body. In her eyes, she wasn't controlling her body at all, but rather her blades. From Lionel's senses, he could see that Emna was already a step away from forming 7th-dimensional blade force. This meant that it was very likely that on the day she succeeded, she would leap from the 5th dimension into the 7th dimension directly. And not only that, but she would also be among one of the most powerful 7th-dimensional powerhouses in the whole of the human domain. This is the power of fusing your paths into one. Her ability index, her partially completed lineage factor, even her practice method itself, all have the exact same origin, and due to that, she's extraordinarily powerful, even to the point of being able to assassinate a 7th-dimensional powerhouse at the 5th dimension. Lionel was rarely impressed. Too rarely. But at this moment, he was completely won over. It seemed that his judgment was quite good. Chapter 1754. Published at 10th of April 2023 11:04 and 34 seconds AM. Chapter 1754. Silence if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. I've got it. Lionel suddenly spoke. There was no point in watching Emna run around like a headless chicken. He didn't believe that she would find much of anything else even if she dug to the center of the asteroid. Emna looked up with surprise. It had only been a few seconds. Why did Lionel make it sound so final? Also, why was he holding that contraption? This is a communication device. I haven't analyzed it yet, but it should be embedded into a network of other similar communication devices. So long as we analyze it properly, it won't be very difficult to find the locations of the other stations. I believe that this is all there is to find. Emna's brows raised. She could somewhat tell that although Lionel was being a bit reserved with his words, he was absolutely certain about his assessment. You want to do the analysis personally? Emna asked. Lionel nodded. Deconstructing this will take someone at least nearing the extremities of the silver grade, and it would be even better if they had a working knowledge of the gold grade. The force arts used are highly complex and a single mistake could cause the entire network to collapse. I feel the most comfortable if I do it. Okay, Emna agreed readily. But she was inwardly surprised. Lionel seemed to be implying that he was at such a standard, which was shocking for someone so young. Just making it into the 6th dimension shouldn't guarantee being a silver grade crafter. Regardless, their organization truly didn't have anyone near that standard. They only had a few silver grade crafters, but they were nowhere near the extremities of the grade. In that case, will you return now? I can't, Lionel shook his head. There are about 3 big issues I have to deal with as quickly as possible before they spin out of control. I need to return to Earth to gather up my brothers first and deal with them as quickly as possible. I will come and touch base with you in. Lionel's voice trailed off. His senses were far too sharp. The instant he mentioned his brothers, Emna's gaze flickered with an unreadable light, almost as though she had thought of something, but couldn't quite confirm it. However, after a few moments, her expression suddenly became a hint solemn, a hint regretful, and then a hint hesitant. Seeing that Lionel suddenly fall silent, Emna's heart skipped a beat. There was nothing but silence, and in the depths of space. This shouldn't be too shocking, but for some reason everything seemed to have come to a stop. Lionel didn't ask any questions, but his expressionless gaze seemed to put all the onus on her. Emna didn't know where to start. For some reason, she felt herself shivering. This was already the 2nd time she had lost her composure in front of Lionel. She, an assassin known for her nerves of steel, couldn't even quite make herself look this man in the eye. His presence seemed sturdier than the earth and broader than the skies. It was absolutely suffocating. Emna exhaled a shaky breath. During Earth's metamorphosis into the 6th dimension, 4 families suddenly appeared outside of the usual noble families. They felt far stronger than the most powerful 3 of Earth. The Fox family, the Dove family and the Scarlet family. They were the Aderna family, the Critus family, the Lavis family and the Brazinger family. Earth fell into a situation of great internal strife which made it difficult to stop outside influences from also encroaching onto their territory, and war broke out on Earth's surface for the 2nd time since Terrain's assault. I don't know. The situation was too odd. It didn't feel like those 4 families were trying very hard. They didn't press where they had to, and they gave up a lot of opportunities seemingly without cause or reason. But regardless, the end result was devastating and many lost their lives. During that time, many of the young talents of Earth who had managed to make it into the Void Palace returned. Back then, the situation of the Void Palace hadn't been stabilized, as all of the Void Elders and Void Senators had yet to return. As such, the rules were far easier to break. When they returned, however, the nonchalance of the 4 families seemed to vanish, as though this was exactly what they had been looking for. In one fell swoop, they sent out their own geniuses, and the geniuses of Earth that had rocked and shocked the human domain were devastated. They died in droves. Almost an entire generation of Earth's greatest talents died one after another. It was only after Princess Alienor returned from the cataclysm that the tides managed to turn. But even so, it went from a slaughter fest to a stalemate, and once again, the 4 families went back to their oddly passive behavior until they suddenly sent out another wave. Beneath this wave, even the likes of Princess Alienor found herself terribly suppressed. Until she finally managed to break into the 7th dimension. Only then did the situation truly stabilize, and the 4 families took a step back. Even in doing so, however, they carved out large amounts of Earth's territory for themselves, taking over several planets and even the moon itself. In that war, several of your brothers died. Drake, Milan, Gil, Franco, and Raj. They didn't make it. Lionel didn't say anything from start to finish. Even when Emna was done, he stood in silence, simply closing his eyes. He didn't seem to breathe, as though he had become a standing corpse. His heart didn't beat. The world seemed to lose the ability to interact with him, as though he had stepped into a world completely separate from them. Without a word, Lionel turned and walked away. Emna opened her mouth to say something, but couldn't bring herself to say anything in the end. She had been there when Lionel went against the Milky Way Guild all alone just to not risk implicating his brothers. She knew well how deep their relationship ran. Even though Lionel hadn't said a single word, she knew he was furious. Endlessly furious. Chapter 1755. Published at 10th of April 2023 11:04 and 31 seconds AM. Chapter 1755. Fury. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Mighty auras surrounded Earth. The ocean tides rose like walls blocking out the skies. Forests worth of trees swayed so violently that they threatened to be pulled up by the roots, and the earth shook and quaked, splintering, dividing and rippling like waves. A shadow seemed to envelop the planet. The sheer number of ships and vessels in the skies made it feel as though an eclipse had descended, stripping Earth of all of its light. When these members of the Brazinger family appeared, the protective units of Earth reacted immediately. Several cannons pointed into the sky as the air protection units took action first. Not long later, a strong surge of pressure soared upward, countering the presence of the Brazinger family almost immediately. If Lionel had been here, he would have recognized these people as the members of the Slayer Legion. However, by now, they had already returned to their proper duty of being the shields of the royal family. At the helm, a middle-aged man with the aura of an old ruffian stood on the walls of a fort, a machete resting on his shoulder. This middle-aged man was none other than Old Hutch, the only pseudo-master figure Lionel had ever had in his life. By now, Old Hutch didn't seem so old anymore, and his aura was even sharper and more violent than it ever had been before. By his side, there was yet another old man that Lionel would have recognized. And that was his coach Owen, whose upper lip was still bristling with a gray mustache. The duo looked infuriated with the world. But right now, they had every right to be. The number of promising youths that Earth had lost at the hands of these four families was far too many. What these two older men had in common was their love of watching the youth rise up. And yet they had to watch helplessly as they outlived some young men and women they had viewed almost like their own sons and daughters. Old Hutch had lost count of the number of promising youths of the Slayer Legion that had fallen before him. He had promised himself that such a thing wouldn't happen again after the war against Terrain, and yet it all didn't matter in the slightest. He was used to having the strength to turn the tides on his own. But he was born long before the metamorphosis. The amount of talent he had was limited in comparison to the up-and-coming youths because he had to work against the tides of age for every step forward he took. Time and time again, the moniker of Hacker Hutch became no different from an ironic jab to the heart for him. What Hacker Hutch? Unless it meant that he stood idly by as his children were hacked to pieces, then maybe only then could he so proudly accept the name. Coach Owen's mustache whipped about in the wind, his gaze red with fury. Ever since Lionel had sent him back to Earth and saved him from the brink of death, he had been doing his best to raise up the contingent. He hadn't forgotten the tough ask Lionel had made of him. He believed in that young man to the point he had put his heart and soul into the task, and yet he could only watch as his boys died one after another. He had been coaching Lionel and the others since they could barely hold a football in their hands. He had watched them grow into men who could carry the weight of the world on their shoulders, only for them to be slaughtered one after another. Even now, he could still remember the final grins on their faces as they breathed their last. He could see the young Drake. Even after a decade, they still called that poor brat a rookie even though he was maybe more mature than them all. All his life, Drake had had big shoes to fill. As Lionel's backup and the man fated to succeed Lionel, that was a weight he had carried with him, and yet, instead of shirking from the responsibility, he accepted it in silence. His mark on the world seemed so small, and yet it was that small mark, that silence that made him so strong. He could see Milan's face, that cheery young man who always swore to protect Lionel's front. He was the wall, the first line of defense, a young man who would dig in his heels rather than bend his back. Arnold was a man who never showed any sort of emotion, never deviating from his baseline, but seeing his ball like a little boy when Milan breathed his life was a sound and sight that Coach Owen would never forget. Every time he recalled it, another piece of his heart would shatter. P Alpha D Alpha knew. He could see the face of Gil and Franco, that pair of perverts who always relentlessly butt heads. He remembered their final moments, standing side by side like brothers, neither of them wanting to retreat from the side of the other. Even amidst all their arguments, their bond was maybe among the very strongest in the end. He could see the face of Raj, that big lug who always had some witty to say. He was Lionel's blindside protector, a forever wall, an immovable force. Even in his final moments, he stood tall and sturdy, a silly but sad grin plastered on his face. He roared into the skies, lamenting only the fact that he didn't get the chance to build his harem before he breathed his last. Every time Coach Owen thought of these memories, he wanted to roar into the skies, his fury rising like a tempest. However, when he saw what was in the skies, Coach Owen was so apoplectic with rage that his vision went entirely black, the city walls beneath his feet shattering. Amidst the Brazingers, a young man with a group of 8 lenses hovering over a single eye stepped forward. His face didn't seem to have any fury or wrath on it. In fact, he seemed to be distracted by words and numbers flying across his lenses. He stood on a platform of pure black that seemed fused together with black-silver sand, absent-mindedly doing something before he seemed to realize where he was. If Lionel was present, he would recognize this young man as Simeon, the very first true member of the Brazinger family he had ever met. However, if Lionel had been present, he wouldn't have been looking at Simeon at all. Rather, he would have been looking at the two young men who hovered beneath him, seemingly holding up his platform. On one side, there was a large young man, standing at over 7 feet tall and with a belly as round as a globe. His skin was a nice brown color, however his gaze seemed dull and lifeless. On the other side was an unassuming young man of slim stature and somewhat handsome features. He seemed reserved and he would be difficult to pick out in a crowd, but his gaze was likewise dull and lifeless. Anyone could see the large young man had been used to form that platform while the other young man was used to carry and control the platform. Together, they moved it smoothly and without issue, moving like a pair of obedient servants. These two young men were none other than Raj and Drake. Chapter 1756. Published at 10th of April 2023 11:04 and 30 seconds AM. Chapter 1756. Ball of fire. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. After a long while, Simeon seemed to finally remember where he was and he snapped out of his thoughts, casually looking down toward the fort beneath him. Despite the fact firepower capable of blasting the moon to pieces was trained on him, his expression didn't flicker even a single time. Simeon's hands clapped close in the air as though he was closing an invisible book. Everything about his actions were casual and unhurried. Where's your emperor? Why has he not come out to see me yet? Simeon's words were soft but they spread with an insuppressible might. He didn't seem to take Emperor Fox seriously at all, directly asking him to make his presence known. Fury surged in the hearts of the citizens of Earth. Emperor Fox was a god in all of their hearts. The prestige he had built up from the third-dimensional realms into the seventh-dimensional realms was incomparably solid. As much as the people also had Lionel in their hearts, erasing hundreds of years of near worship in just a handful of years was impossible. In addition, as far as everyone else saw it, Lionel's accomplishments, and Noah's for the matter, were only right. After all, how could Emperor Fox have inferior grandchildren? Every time they accomplished something mighty, it was actually only bolstering Emperor Fox in the eyes of the people. As a result, in return for his words, Simeon only received nothing but silence. However, this sort of silence was harmonious in its symphony. Billions of gazes looked into the skies, their expressions just the same. Simeon suddenly sneered, "A collection of ants. Since your emperor refuses to give me an explanation for the slaughter of my people, then that makes this matter even simpler. A debt of blood must be repaid with blood. Wipe out half the population of Earth and imprison the other half. That should be about enough to weigh evenly." The words of Simeon couldn't have been more demeaning. Not mentioning the sheer number of Earthlings who had died during the first descent of the 4 families. How could a few dozen or even 100 lives compare to the billions on Earth currently? In the decades Lionel had been gone, the main priority of the Ascension Empire was to increase the population of Earth, which had been whittled to strikingly few after the metamorphosis. To increase from a population of just millions to billions in just a few decades sounded ridiculous, and truly it was. However, under a shocking change, the people of Terrain who should have taken 5 generations to become true citizens of Earth only took a single one under some mysterious power, of course. This mysterious power was bestowed by Emperor Fox himself, which was also a large part of the reason the citizens of Earth were so respectful of him. The people of Terrain thought that they would be forced to be enslaved for generations before they got a chance. Some of the more pessimistic among them thought that this was all a lie and they would never gain such a chance. But in a twist of fate, they could see with their own eyes as their children rose up to become paragons and young elites of the human race. Just like this, the vast majority of the former people of Terrain wholeheartedly embraced Earth as their home. From the very beginning, it was not their choice to wage war against Earth. It had always been the choice of a few families and organizations. The rewards gained would have never been their own to begin with. But now, their thoughts had long since strayed from Terrain. That barren place wasn't their home. This was their home. They too had fought in the war against the 4 families. They too had watched their youths die one after another. They too felt the stiling hatred as they stared up into the skies. So when Simenon's voice descended, their fury rose up like a tempest, seemingly wanting to shred Simeon to pieces with nothing more than their eyes. But, even so, with a casual glance, Simeon waved a hand toward the warriors to his back. Without fail, each of them exuded mighty and unprecedented auras. Their strengths caused even the air to quake. However, before they could take action, there was a sudden change atop the blooming ascension tree. A mighty golden light shot into the skies. Simeon's sneer returned. Now your emperor wants to appear? It's far too late for that. Maybe if the mighty Emperor Fox falls to his knees, I might consider reducing the punishment by 10%. The pillar of light shot into the skies, tearing through the clouds and appearing tall and proud. When the lights cleared, Simeon's sneer paused. At that moment, it became clear that it wasn't Emperor Fox at all, but rather a young man wielding a saber easily twice the length of his body. Despite not having a flying treasure, he stood in the skies as easily as though it was the earth. With just a single glance, every person of Earth recognized this young man. This was none other than their prince, Noah Fox. Noah stood in the air with a violent look in his eyes. He was a man that rarely showed any sort of emotion at all, but hearing the piercing words about the man he respected most, his grandfather, the murderous intent in Noah's heart had reached its absolute peak. Even so, when he saw the state of Raj and Drake's corpses, a fiendish green radiance burst from his body, causing the skies to dark and the clouds to accumulate. Simeon's frozen sneer became an expressionless gaze soon after, his raised hand continuing to descend and point forward. A mere prince of this backwater place? Who the hell cared if he was infuriated? The warriors of the Brazinger family charged forward. What no one expected was that the moment war was about to descend, the situation would change entirely. All sound vanished and the world seemed to lose its color. All those who looked into the skies could see a blinding ray of white light thousands of kilometers across. It was brighter than even the sun itself, burning its image into the minds of all those who saw it. The moment the beam appeared, it collided with the moon and a void seemed to form. The entire moon was swallowed whole in the blink of an eye. When the beam vanished, there was no lush greenery or gorgeous blue oceans any longer, there was only a land of black and ash, burnt to a crisp with a single strike. The moon, its resources, its people, had all been eradicated in a breath. The temperature of Earth began to slowly rise as though a second sun had appeared in the skies, the wild flames pulsing at the hearts of all those who laid eyes on it. When the people of the Brazinger family turned back, they couldn't help but freeze in absolute silence. In the skies, a shadow seemed to walk out from those flames, the darkness around him entirely conspicuous as a moon-sized ball of fire flickered to his back. Chapter 1757. Published at 10th of April 2023 11:04 and 29 seconds AM. Chapter 1757. Wreathed in blood. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The figure was nothing more than a speck of dust in comparison to the size of the moon. And yet as he walked forward, it felt as though the moon had lit itself on fire to herald his appearance. The sound of billions of heartbeats beating in unison began to drum across the skies. The entire world seemed to resonate with the footsteps of this young man as he took one step after another. Despite his seemingly slow pace, he crossed countless kilometers with every stride, and by the time he had come close enough for his features to be differentiable from the blazing moon to his back, the shock that took hold of those watching him was enough to stop their hearts entirely. Lionel slowly walked through the skies, his gaze frighteningly cold and his lips pinched into a line. Wisps of red fog came from his eyes, his breath and his hair, the menacing stench of blood rising into the skies. He looked as though he had just crawled out from his own coffin, a ghastly wound stretched from his left chest down to his right hip, showing off glistening bronze pieces of his ribcage and inner organs. His left arm hung from his shoulder socket by just a few tendons and ligaments. His clothing was nowhere to be seen and he walked completely in the nude. Seemingly oblivious to this fact entirely, it truly seemed as though that he just might collapse at any moment, so why were they feeling such fear? The ghastly black rod in Lionel's right hand billowed with fiendish fog as dark as night. It suddenly trembled, forcing the amorphous fog to sharp and become a twin pair of menacing curved blades that found their home at the end of the rod. Lionel didn't speak a single word. He didn't roar in rage. He didn't tremble in anger. He didn't even seem to be able to see the people around him. His gaze was cold, but entirely unfocused, as though he saw right through everything around him. And then, his foot raised and he took another step forward. Bang! Lionel's dangling left shoulder merely glanced by the body of a Brazinger family member, and yet they erupted into a ball of flames before bursting into a shower of blood that was quickly incinerated to ash. This person didn't even get the chance to scream or holler. They were simply eviscerated. At that exact instant, a spaceship that happened to be beneath Lionel's feet was suddenly enveloped by an illusory box formed of spatial force, before its pilot and crew could even try to maneuver out of it. The box collapsed to a tenth of its original size, squashing them into junk metal. Lionel exhaled just a single breath, seemingly finally breathing for the first time. But just that single breath caused sparks to light in the air. The heat was too much for those in the surrounding 10 meters of him to handle, and they caught on fire. Tragic screams finally broke the silence, and many woke up to the fact that just a single step of Lionel seemed to be like the call of the Grim Reaper. Rumble. Lionel stepped into Earth's atmosphere for the first time, and the world changed. All around, the pristine white clouds rumbled, gathering together and forming enormous behemoth-like monstrosities that thundered with enough force to make the grounds quake and mountains collapse. When the Emperor was furious, the skies would sunder. At that moment, above Lionel's head, the void trembled and an ancient scroll appeared. It radiated a blinding golden light, outshining even the moon blazing to his back. The ancient scroll slowly unfurled, the blinding light it exuded only becoming ever more so. The moment it unfurled completely, surges of lightning coursed through the air, pulsing with golden, green and radiant royal blue arcs. Emperor's Edict. The ancient characters of the Golden Edict rose like a tempest, enveloping the hundreds of kilometers. All those of the Brazinger family. This was the first time Lionel spoke since he appeared. The instant he did, he seemed to conjure the phantom of a malevolent ghost draped in the robes of withering black. Die. The words fell and the world shuddered. The skies whined and gods lamented. The spirits of life shed tears and wraiths of death laughed uproariously. One after another. Almost every single member of the Brazinger family within the range of Lionel's edict suddenly trembled. Their gazes turning blank as they fell one after another. Their ships began to fall from the skies and their flying treasures wheeled out of control. Horror was painted on the faces of the Brazinger family members outside of the barrier as it quickly approached them, seemingly wanting to envelop the entire world. The radiance of the Golden Edict pulsed and surged, being fueled by Lionel's fury and surging through the skies. With just a single sentence, Lionel passed judgment. However, that was when something heart-rending occurred. With a surge, Lionel's inner organs suddenly exploded. In another breath, his right arm imploded and ended up in a similar state to his left. In yet another breath, his knee collapsed, suddenly twisting in the wrong direction and bending at an awkward angle. Despite this occurring, Lionel's expression didn't change a single time. Every time a Brazinger family member managed to resist his edict, another devastating wound would appear on Lionel's body. However, in comparison to those that managed to survive, those that died were far greater in number. Lionel didn't seem to care at all about the damage to himself. He just wanted them to die. He wanted them all to die. The edict above Lionel's head fluttered and the words changed. The corpses falling from the sky suddenly burst into clouds of blood, surging toward Lionel in a torrential wave. A dark gold light wrapped around Lionel's body and a six-armed, three-headed panda construct took form, roaring into the skies. At the same time, Lionel, who had seemingly been on the brink of death, was suddenly healed, his wounds closing amidst a dark gold light in the blink of an eye. The panda construct raised up two arms and a familiar metal spirit took form. Little Tolly surged toward the squared spaceship Lionel had crushed and enveloped it. Every time the fingers of the panda construct tapped at the air, another change would take place and the skies would rumble all the more. In just a few breaths, Little Tolly separated into tens of thousands of pieces and the skies were enveloped by the light of countless javelins. The humans of Earth were entirely shaken. From the moon being wiped out to the current state of hundreds of Brazingers falling every second, everything had happened too quickly. These vent to their rage had come too suddenly, but why was it that they couldn't feel any sort of happiness? They could tell that Lionel truly had no intention of asking them for help. Not once did he look toward them, and he even seemed to look through them all much the same way he looked through the Brazinger family members. He had come here for slaughter. In fact, he was already wreathed in blood. Chapter 1758. Published at 10th of April 2023 11:04 and 12 seconds AM. Chapter 1758. Carnage. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The remaining 4 arms of the panda construct raised into the air as a crafting quill appeared in Lionel's left hand. His intent blazed into the skies, 4 replicas of his crafting quill appearing in each hand. Space warped and force surged as Lionel rode across the air. Ancient-looking runes formed one after another, touching a speed that made those who understood what was happening feel as though they were dreaming. Every time Lionel finished another force art, it shot into the skies, filling his surroundings with magic circles of all sorts of colors. The javelins blotted out all the light in the skies, trembling as they passed through these ancient runes one after another. With every completion, their auras changed entirely, the strength they exuded causing countless hearts to skip a beat. Blazing flames, blinding golden lights, twisting vortexes of space. Each and every javelin seemed to have an entirely different shape and form, aimed toward the survivors of the Brazinger family. All the while, Lionel's footsteps hadn't stopped. He continued to walk forward as though nothing could stop his forward momentum. Nothing would halt his massacre on this day. The quills in the panda construct's 4 hands vanished as the javelins suddenly moved. In one moment, they were almost entirely still. But in the next instant, they flashed forward with such speed that their former location seemed to implode with blasts of concentrated air. Several roars filled the skies as the Brazinger family members seemed to finally snap out of their shock. They had been so caught off guard by the sudden changes that they couldn't even breathe. Watching the moon suddenly be enveloped by flames, its atmosphere burning to ash and the land being buried beneath furious crimson flickers had left them stunned. But the moment they realized what happened, it seemed to settle in all at once. They were all dead? The eyes of the Brazinger warriors turned entirely red, their berserk god lineage factor surging out of control. Not all members of the Brazinger family had the purest form of the berserk god lineage factor. Many were like Aina before she reined her curse into her control, easily capable of losing themselves in bloodlust and carnage. The instant they were triggered by their fury, their roars shook the skies, wild crimson auras surging from their bodies as they grabbed their weapons and charged forward all at once. But that was when Lionel's javelins descended. A warrior at the front was sucked into a vortex of space, his body shredded to pieces in an instant. The moment the vortex stopped rotating, it spit out the bits and pieces of his flesh and bones, allowing it to rain down from the skies. To his side, a blazing javelin of fire tore through the chest of 3 Brazingers in a row. They ran forward 2 more steps each before they combusted into balls of fire, falling in a rain of ash. On the other side of the battlefield, a javelin rotating with a deep, dark blue collided with a burly man that stood well over 2 meters tall. He had his axe raised above his head, closing the distance on Lionel with speed his body shouldn't have been able to carry, and yet, the instant he met the javelin, it felt as though he had been hit with a sledgehammer. It sounded as though a speeding truck had collided with a steel wall. The burly man exploded on contact, mashed bundles of flesh and blood falling from the skies. Only he knew that he had actually dodged. But it didn't seem to matter. It was as though the entire area around the javelin had become a heavy mass, the air around it becoming part of its power. The massacre was on as large of a scale as his emperor's edict, but the power of the men and women who fell were on a completely different level. This didn't seem to matter to Lionel in the slightest as he cut them down like weeds. Weaker? Stronger? He would kill as many as there were. Lionel's freed 4 arms flipped their palms even as Ria's force quill vanished to be replaced with the white lion bow. In that instant, 4 exact replicas appeared in his 4 palms, raising up 4 bows and aiming them all forward. Each one was over 6 meters from tip to tip, laying horizontally within Lionel's hand. 4 javelins descended from around Ryu, loaded into the bow and slowly pulled the strings back. The scent of death permeated the air. Somehow, the danger seemed to multiply 10 times over, the power of Lionel's archery causing the skies to tremble. Boom! 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 They were all released at once, the air collapsing and the booming calls of thunder being drowned out. Everywhere the javelins passed, dozens died, the residual auras alone capable of ripping everything in their path to pieces. However, even after this, for more javelins floated over, knocking into Lionel's 4 bows and pushing their strings back. Wild currents of bow force took shape, spiraling like drill cones. Boom! 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 Lionel alone became like an artillery unit. With every step, dozens would die. Never once did he slow or pause, it was as though his feet were carrying him toward a certain location. He was no different from a god of carnage. Not the slightest fluctuation could be seen in his eyes, his indifference and coldness shining through like a chilly wind that licked across the back of their necks. That's enough. Booming voices of fury layered atop of one another. 4 young geniuses shot forward, 2 men and 2 women. Their gazes blazed with a trail of crimson, but their eyes had a clarity the others simply didn't have. There was no doubt that they had full access to the Berserk God lineage factor, each and every one of the being at tier 7 at the very least. They finally closed the distance on Lionel, attacking him from all sides, their power causing the skies to clap like thunder. Chapter 1759. Published at 10th of April 2023 11:04 and 10 seconds AM. Chapter 1759. Next, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel didn't even look directly at them, their speed had little effect on him, just when it seemed that their attacks would envelop him entirely, until his 4 bows suddenly shifted, the 4 youths froze, suddenly finding the tips of 4 javelins pointed toward each one of their faces. There were no words exchanged, no roar of fury, not even a single glance. With a slight pull, the bowstrings shot out like iron balls from a cannon, colliding with their heads before they could react and shattering them to pieces. The Brazinger family members didn't even get a chance to sigh a breath of relief. Those 4 had been some of their best talents, if they were placed in the Void Palace. Even the Cataclysm generation wouldn't be able to stand up to them. Or at the very least, the vast majority of the Cataclysm generation would be helpless, and yet Lionel didn't seem to take them seriously at all. His bow aiming and firing just once, shredding them all to pieces. At that moment, Simeon, who had turned to watch all of this with an indifferent expression, narrowed his gaze. In just the few moments since Lionel had appeared, over 10% of the people he had brought died, constituting thousands of lives. And even then, he didn't seem nearly satisfied at all. What was even clearer was the fact that Lionel was walking forward in a line that couldn't have been straighter, a line that aimed and directed right toward him, from the beginning. Lionel hadn't said a word to Simeon, in fact. He hadn't even looked toward him, he didn't suddenly lose himself in a tempest of rage. Nor did he demand a thing, if he wanted something. He would take it, for being a part of not only the death of his brothers, to also use them as puppets after their death. Filled Lionel with more rage than he knew how to put in words. Within his body, his scarlet star innate nodes trembled with a red-gold light, causing the flickering flames that danced in the surroundings to dance with a menacing cadence. With every step forward Lionel took, he closed the distance between himself and Simeon. He had already been enraged past the point of no return before he even stepped foot back on Earth. But now, what's going on? What happened here? Joel looked up into the skies, his gaze sharpening as he watched the dark clouds above rumble. Currently, 3 of Lionel's brothers were side by side. They couldn't see what was happening currently because the trio, Joel, Arnold and Alan, were training in the depths of the ocean. In fact, if their time during the last decade or so was accounted for, it could be said that over 90% of it was spent here. Even after so long, the oceans of Earth were still an incredibly dangerous place. They were simply far too large, and the number of individuals with water-based abilities that could properly fight in this region, although not rare, were far too few. The advantage the beasts born and raised in this region had was unprecedented, and after the disappearance of the koi fish, many other king beasts had risen up to threaten the populations of Earth. Things only becoming worse with every step of evolution. Beasts were different from other races in this way. Much of their talent was ingrained and their progression speed was decided both at birth and by their environments. As such, it could be said that the most talented population of living beings on Earth weren't the humans themselves, but rather the oceanic beasts. This couldn't be helped. While Earth's humans were born with a great amount of talent, this talent mostly came from their ability indexes. They lacked the guidance of techniques to make perfect use of their strength, and as such were mostly self-taught through battle or using the creations of others as reference. Much of these issues would be fixed if Earth had a few main lineage factors. But while Earth likely had the largest concentration of sparks in the whole of the human domain, they still hadn't had the time to grow to their full potential yet. Due to this, the ocean was the perfect training ground, at least to them. Most wouldn't dare to make use of it as they had, but the three of them wanted revenge more than anything else, and they knew that they were far too weak in this state. They would claw back everything those four families had taken from them. The commotion is large, Alan replied. We should go and check it out. The three looked toward one another and nodded, not wasting any more time as they shot toward that direction, the speed leaving trenches in the deep and dark waters. You seem to be very angry, Simeon sneered, looking toward Lionel. It seemed obvious that there wouldn't be anyone here capable of stopping Lionel from closing in the final distance. No matter what talents were thrown at him, Lionel slaughtered them all. He didn't seem to know fatigue. He didn't tire, he didn't rest, he didn't even seem to be breathing heavily. His force was like an endless abyss. Simeon's sneer darkened when he saw that Lionel had no intention of responding before his expression returned to normal, his sneer even deepening. Fine. I'll show you what true helplessness looks like. I'll let you see that before me, you were never worth anything at all. Boom. The platform beneath Simeon shuddered and the knees of Raj and Drake uncontrollably bent in the skies as Simeon's aura could rise. Simeon's crimson hair fluttered wildly, his red eyes piercing through the veil as Raj and Drake prostrated, holding up the platform on their hands and knees. The towering presence of a seventh-dimensional expert tore a hole through the dark clouds. You want to defeat me with just this level of strength? Even if you were in the seventh dimension I wouldn't fear you, let alone now. You have no idea the kind of monster you're poking at. Do you think the blood running through your veins can match up to even a single % of mine? The Brazinger family, the Aderna family, the Lavis family, the Critus family. These are all unfathomable existences you cannot possibly begin to comprehend. At that moment, Lionel finally seemed to look at Simeon. For the first time, he didn't just look through him, he looked right into the very depths of his soul. It was such a shudderingly cold look that Simeon felt his soul freeze over entirely, his body stopping in place and his next words being caught in his throat. And then, Lionel's lips slowly parted. Aderna. Lavis. Critus. I've already destroyed them all. Lionel's head tilted slightly to the side in a fashion that felt decidedly demonic and devilish, wisps of crimson fog forming tails out of the corner of his eyes. His words seemed to come out in whispers that manifested like sharp hisses in one's ear, almost to the point of metal scraping against metal. The Brazingers will follow them now. Simeon's pupils constricted. Chapter 1760. Published at 10th of April 2023 11:04 and 7 seconds AM. Chapter 1760. Entirely if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Bullshit. Simeon roared out, his voice coming out like a concentrated blast of air. He realized almost immediately that he had been agitated by just a few words. If Lionel was really lying, was there a need to react so violently? His expression turned ugly, the concentrated breath of air that came from his roar falling into complete silence when it reached Lionel. It was as though they were standing in two completely different worlds. Simeon had thought a lot about how this day would go. The day he finally met Lionel again, this was a man he had lost at the hands of terribly before. Forced to run away with his tail between his legs, because of Lionel. He had missed an opportunity to meditate at the center of a force eruption, and that was something he would never forget. but even worse than that. The third time he met Lionel. When he and the other 3 young geniuses of the Aderna Critus and Lavis families were hunting the golden-scaled koi fish. He was once again humiliated, and this time Lionel didn't even seem to use any effort to force them into a state of trepidation. While it was true that they hadn't fought during that third interaction, the genius of the Aderna family paying Lionel back for saving his little sister and thus holding them back, Simeon could still remember that look of cold indifference in Lionel's eyes, as though he didn't take him seriously at all. The very same look Lionel was giving him now, even disregarding the gap in their dimensions. Simeon had lost his composure the moment he decided to speak so much in the first place. He had been dreaming about the day Lionel saw him use his brothers as puppets. Dreaming about the rage that would be in his eyes. Dreaming about the helplessness in his expression, but now they were finally here. And he saw none of that. There was nothing but a fathomless depth. Simeon's expression twisted, his fury boiling over as the whites of his eyes pulsed with crimson veins. However, after a moment, he exhaled a breath, suddenly regaining his calm. Fight this man personally? Was he even worthy? He would do what he had always done with the ants beneath his feet. Drown them. Simeon waved a hand and his 8 lenses rotated until they came to a stop with a glowing lens taking the center position. A pulse of spatial force rippled before him, causing a rip in reality to form out from his rip. One after another, grotesque monstrosities stepped out, each exuding an aura that oppressed the world. The first was a werewolf covered in crimson fur and a flaming mane. It had claws that were over a meter long, dangling lower than even the soles of its feet. These claws seemed to be a solid silver metal at times, but at others, it would ripple and become plumes of fire, dancing between solid and translucent states. The second was a cobbled-together mess of circuits, wires, tubes and flesh. Its head seemed to be its body, and its arms came out from its ears, and while its legs came out from its neck, pulsing flesh that looked like brains were plastered all over it with seemingly no rhyme or reason. The third was seemingly a ball of water, but its inside squirmed about with intestines that looked like they had been ripped right out of a human and preserved within the water. And while it looked no different from water, the smell it gave off was that of a strong sulfuric acid, burning the nose hairs of even those hundreds of miles away. The others were all just as terrible, making them all look like science fair projects that had gone terribly wrong. Kill him. A ball of acid surged forward, suddenly forming a tsunami-like wall, the intestines within it becoming exposed to the air and combusting everything they came into contact with. The air caught on fire with a green flame that exuded a smell that made one's stomach turn. The crimson werewolf took a step and vanished, becoming a line of fire as it rotated to Lionel's back. Its speed was impossible to track with the naked eye, its claws slicing through the air to bisect Lionel from the hip. The flesh mech soared high about Lionel's head, crashing down toward his panda construct's head even as its parts sparked and oozed oil and brain juice. All the while, Lionel didn't move a single inch, his crimson gaze still peering into Simeon's soul. Simeon's soul continued to shudder. For some reason, his body felt cold, and no matter how he circulated his force, he couldn't heat himself up. Just when Lionel was about to be forced to take out attacks from all sides, an inconspicuous violet fog took form, forming pockets above him, below him, to his left, right, and to his front and back. The violet fog swirled and suddenly sent ripples in space. Clang! 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 Simeon's face suddenly paled to a sheet of white. All around Lionel, valiant warriors stepped out, wafting a royal violet fog that made them look like shimmering nebulas. They looked both real and unreal, both corporeal and incorporeal. However, each one of them donned an armor that made one's heart palpitate. What shook Simeon to his core, though, wasn't this. Rather, it was the shields of force they used to block his puppets and the auras they exuded. Before each valiant warrior, there was a barrier of thin transparent blue energy. Every so often, a ripple would appear over it every so often, especially when it was disrupted. When this ripple spread, the small dragon-like scales this barrier was formed by became slightly more obvious before it settled down again. This energy. No, this lineage factor. This was the lineage factor of the Aderna family. But even worse than that was the auras all of these valiant warriors exuded. Without fail, each and every one of them was in the seventh dimension. The portals of violet fog continued to pulse, more and more experts standing out one after another. Before Simeon could even blink once, more than 100 had appeared, each of them wearing mighty violet armor. Bang! With a slight grunt, the valiant warriors caused Simeon's puppets to implode, their bodies being shredded to pieces one after another. All at once, these valiant souls turned their heads toward Simeon. At that moment, it all sank in. Lionel wasn't lying at all. The Aderna family. He had already wiped them out. Not only had he wiped them out, he snatched their souls from the afterlife to do battle for him. He was a demon. Simeon looked toward Lionel's tilted head and his heart stopped beating entirely. Chapter 1761. Published at 10th of April 2023 11:04 and 6 seconds AM. Chapter 1761. Rise. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1761. Rise. The 6 valiant warriors around Lionel shot forward. Lionel didn't even seem to need to personally control them at all, as though his gaze being focused on Simeon alone was enough to communicate everything that needed to be. Simeon's expression warped, his pale features twisting as his lenses quickly rotated. It was clear that he couldn't be casual any longer. The seventh-dimensional experts of the 4 families weren't individuals he could look down on, and somehow, they didn't seem to have lost any strength at all after falling into Lionel's clutches. Simeon couldn't wrap his head around how Lionel could possibly control seventh-dimensional souls to begin with, let alone so many of them at the same time. He didn't even seem to be struggling. It was one thing for Simeon because his puppets were genetically modified. He didn't have to actively maintain control over them. They were bred into slaves with his own unique mark. They were reared to have a sort of symbiotic relationship with him that forced them to listen to him no matter what. Other than directing them, he didn't need to waste any stamina in controlling them. But Simeon knew Lionel didn't have his ability index, and even if Lionel did, it was clear that this method wasn't the same as his own. So how was this happening? One after another, strong summons stepped out and surrounded Simeon. The more that appeared, the less grotesque and more normal they became. But it was precisely this that made them so much more powerful than the others. It was clear that the closer to normal evolution Simeon's puppets reached, the more power they were able to output. An all-out war broke out in the skies. Simeon might have only recently entered the 7th dimension in the last few years, but his number of 7th-dimensional puppets wasn't small. In fact, they outnumbered Lionel's own, unfortunately for him. Though the quality of Lionel's was far beyond his own. And to make matters worse, 10 of Simeon's puppets managed to surround one of Lionel's valiant warriors, their fists and legs lashing out all at once and suffocating it to the point it could react. Bang! The soul construct shattered, unable to withstand the blow. But just when Simeon's puppets were about to rush toward another section of the battlefield, under his astonished gaze, the valiant warrior's illusory pieces fused back together once more, throwing out a sudden punch that caused the puppets off guard and killed 3 of them in a single strike. Simeon's expression was ashen. Lionel only continued to walk forward slowly, closing in the distance with every stride. He felt invincible, as though there was absolutely nothing that could happen that could stop his forward momentum. Suddenly, Simeon realized how useless it was to take Lionel's brothers as puppets. He couldn't use them as bait or hostages, and Lionel didn't even seem to react to their existence at all. What good were corpses in threatening a man who was living and breathing? He could tell that Lionel was doing it on purpose. With Lionel's speed, how could he have not closed the distance yet? With his strength, how could he not have attacked directly yet? With his means, why wasn't he ahead on a pike yet? Lionel wanted him to feel despair. He wanted him to feel helpless. He wanted him to feel small. He wanted him to feel as though there was nothing in the world that could save him. No man, no God, no existence. For a moment, it seemed that Lionel himself was the one with 6 arms and 3 heads. He was the demon striding through the skies. What surrounded him wasn't just a construct at all. It was a projection of the darkness in his soul. Suddenly, several roars rocked the skies. Hundreds of men and women with streaming tears in their eyes burst through the dense and dark storm clouds. Lightning crackled around them, sometimes even lashing against their skin, but they didn't seem to notice at all. Their faces were already covered in soot, their clothes partially or almost entirely burned off. It was clear at a glance who these individuals were. They were the survivors of Lionel's devastation of the moon, and for them to have survived such a thing, there was no doubt that each and every one of them was an expert of the seventh dimension. Seeing this, Simeon finally breathed, seeing a small light of hope. The Brazingers were all warriors, and they were all more powerful in a state of fury. Simeon simply didn't believe they couldn't turn this around. However, in his search for a light of hope, Simeon had forgotten something very important. Lionel had already done this 3 times before. How had Lionel, a man merely at tier 1 of the 6th dimension, been able to fight a battle against so many absolute geniuses of the 7th dimension? The answer was that he hadn't. Lionel continued to walk forward, his stride never changing. He wanted Simeon to feel the greatest despair. What greater despair was there than feeling a final light of hope, only for it to be shattered to pieces before even gaining a chance to bloom? High in the skies, barely within Earth's orbit, the rotating cannons of a flagship the size of a moon finally cooled. Slowly, it turned from facing the moon toward Earth, a shift occurring through its artillery units one by one. Back on the Earth, the furious roars of the Brazinger family's 7th dimensional experts caused the forest to tremble, the ground to quake and the tides to rise. The Earthlings on the ground could only turn pale, their blood running cold. Hand over your life. A fiery-haired woman with tears streaming down her face was the first to arrive. Her sister had just died in her arms, just a small 5th-dimensional expert who couldn't survive in the harshness of space. What chance had she stood with the atmosphere of the moon being burnt to ash? The fiery-haired woman's strength was unprecedented. Everywhere she passed, whether it was Simeon's puppets or Lionel's valiant warriors, they burst into a rain of blood and motes of light, unable to stop her for even a single moment. She appeared above Lionel's head, her fist tearing through the void as she punched downward. Just the momentum of her strike alone caused Lionel's panda construct to ripple and almost collapse. Return my sister to me. Her shrill shrieks curdled one's blood, her hair furiously whipping out in all directions. However, right then, a beam of light that split the world in 2 descended. Lionel didn't even turn back to face her. Her last sight in this world was the indifferent casualness of his back view. Bang! She was incinerated to ashes. Simeon froze. Hope had only appeared for a fleeting moment before it vanished in a buff of smoke and a rain of ash. All he could see in this world was the look in Lionel's eyes as his lips slowly separated. Rise. Lionel's soft words reverberated through the world, causing a vortex of power to form around the ashes of the fallen woman. Soon, a valiant woman donning violet illusory armor appeared, her crimson hair fluttering as she kneeled toward Lionel, her head lowered in absolute obedience. More chapters later today. Chapter 1762. Published at 10th of April 2023 11:04 and 4 seconds AM. Chapter 1762, Demon. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The soul construct quickly stood to her feet, her illusory crimson hair fluttering as she stood valiantly in the skies. She didn't seem to have a single hint of the grievances of the past, and her aura only seemed to grow. Kill. She roared. The world fell into silence as the woman turned around and charged toward her fellow family members. Her previously shrill shrieks were still echoing through the skies, but after a moment, they faded, replaced by passionate roars. She even seemed to smile, as though she couldn't be happier to battle for her pride of her emperor. Bang. 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 She directly killed 3 warriors of the Brazinger family. It was clear that in their final moments, they hesitated, not knowing whether or not to attack. And yet that small gap in time was enough in a battle of 7th-dimensional powerhouses. She laughed into the skies, her heroism booming beneath the flashing lightning. She became an arc of crimson herself as she flashed about. Everywhere she passed, another would fall, the strength she was exuding being enough to fill the hearts of true experts with respect and awe. However, for some reason, it just felt sad, down below. Coach Owen and Old Hutch had been watching from the very beginning. even with the raging torrent of battle around them. Their eyes had never once left Lionel. Their expressions weren't as happy as one might expect. Even though the fate of the battle already seemed sealed. There was a hint of sadness in their eyes as well. Kind-hearted people didn't last very long in a world like this, and as such, there were only two paths for them to take. It was either they would lose their lives in the hands of others, or they would no longer be kind-hearted people. There didn't seem to be a third option. Neither of them wanted to see Lionel die. So that necessarily meant that they hoped a day like this one would come. But seeing it for themselves, it left a bitter taste. Most of it felt like it could be ignored, out of sight, out of mind, if you didn't think too much about what was happening. It was easy to make excuses for it or sweep it under the rug, but the appearance of this woman was too jarring, no matter what. That would a woman who had just lost her younger sister. A grieving sibling who wanted nothing more than revenge on Lionel, sure. There might have been a past where she had contributed to the death of others. And likely even the direct death of Earthlings. But what about her sister? How many had Lionel killed in that single assault on the moon? How many were innocent? How many were vulnerable? How many were old men and women with only a few years left to enjoy? How many were children just starting out their lives? And maybe you could say that this was just a sin they would have to bear. After all, weren't the people of Earth victims as well? But which of them had stepped forward to condemn what had happened and what had been about to happen before Lionel appeared? Which of them had said a thing? Which of them had refused? But even so, this was something the Lionel they knew was completely incapable of doing, and yet, not only had he done it now, he had done it 4 times over without batting a single eye. The two had no idea. These two mentors of Lionel had no idea that he had already made a choice far worse than this one just months ago. He had already chosen Aina over the world. So what if he chose his brothers over a mere 4 families? At that moment, the woman's soul construct shattered for what felt like the 100th time. This time, however, she didn't seem capable of reforming. A large chunk of her torso had vanished and her entire right arm was nowhere to be seen. Even so, she laughed into the skies before punching out with her remaining arm and shoving it through the chest of an enemy. Another warrior took advantage and swung a mighty great sword down, severing her left arm. She lashed out with a leg, colliding against a head with her shin and cracking their skull into countless shards that pierced their brain through. Her legs were swept out from under her, quickly shattering beneath the pressure, and yet she still lunged forward, baring her teeth and ripping out the throat of the warrior who did it. Even in her final moments, she was endlessly valiant and she gave everything she had for her emperor, not feeling the sullenness of the atmosphere in the slightest. In fact, she felt nothing but elation and happiness, her laughter ironically grating on the ears of all those who heard. Bang! The woman's head shattered, her laughter finally fading, and yet somehow still echoing in all of their minds. The looks they gave toward the young man who had summoned her had changed from fury, to trepidation, to outright fear. And that was exactly when the young Lionel's lips separated once again. Rise. One after another, every brazinger the woman had killed began to rise up in a fog of violet, their souls appearing donned in armor that shone brighter than even the sun. Without hesitation, they all turned toward Lionel and slammed their fists against their chests, the reverberating impact booming even over the sound of the thunder. Then, they swiftly turned toward their own friends and family, releasing war cries that shook the skies as they charged. The hearts of the spectators went absolutely cold. They knew without a doubt that Lionel had done it on purpose. He could have beckoned them to revive even while the woman was fighting, but it was as though he wanted them all to personally witness her final moments, as though he wanted to force them to witness it all from start to finish. From her harrowing sorrow, to her valiant laugh and brave charge, he forced them to watch, all while he himself didn't seem to care in the slightest. Demon! Demon! Simeon stumbled backward, his will to fight having vanished into thin air. He tripped and fell, falling over the side of the platform that had once held him up. Announcement below. Chapter 1763. Published at 10th of April 2023 11:04 and 2 seconds AM. Chapter 1763. Update: if audio player doesn't work, Press stop then play button again will quickly lay out what's happening on my side so that you guys understand what's going on. Doing my best to try to get chapters out. But promises are hard right about now. The east of Canada and where I'm currently at, Ottawa, is suffering from some freezing rain weather currently. The weather has caused trees to collapse on electricity lines, taking out the power in large sections of the city and even the Wi-Fi and cellular connectivity in some parts. The power was out at my place, so I went to a friend's who had power, but his Wi-Fi and cell service was out. I had to park outside a pizza shop with Wi-Fi to get this out. Big LS. All around, I'll do my best to get today's chapters out, including replacing this one with a real chapter, but if things don't go my way, that will potentially be impossible. Hey, race to hoping that things get fixed soon. It might not be possible for me to post any updates in the near future if they don't, so if you guys don't see anything just assume I couldn't make it work. Sorry about this, guys. I'll try to implement some sort of reward system again to make this up in the future if I can't. Chapter 1764. Published at 10th of April 2023 11:04 a.m. Chapter 1764. Imperatrice: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Previous chapter has been replaced with a real chapter. Read it first. If you cannot see the update, go to Profile Settings, the clear cache. For those who don't understand why a chapter had to be replaced, the announcement is below. You are lucky. Lionel suddenly said as Simeon breathed his last few breaths. If not for your own foolishness, I would have made you suffer a fate far worse than this. Amidst his cackles and deliriousness, Simeon just barely managed to understand Lionel's words and they left him both stunned and infuriated. Was Lionel trying to say that he had showed mercy? This was the funniest thing he had ever heard in this short life of his, however. Before Simeon could think any further, the hand of Lionel's panda construct squeezed down, shattering what remained of Simeon to pieces, from start to finish. Simeon never managed to threaten Lionel even a single time. Rise. Lionel commanded. Simeon's soul was snatched in its attempt to dissipate, forming his body one again as his 8 lenses felt into his illusory hands. Simeon caught them and kneeled, bending his head from so far that his forehead nearly passed his knees. Lionel didn't even look at Simeon. Raising his head to look below, he stood in the skies. Carnage and blood flowing in rivers behind him. He wasn't the only one in the skies. His cousin Noah had approached and hadn't left from the very beginning. And yet it still felt that things were like this. Lionel was both close and yet so far. So near and yet so unfathomably transcendent. It was hard to look at him like a hero. But it was also almost impossible not to, even so. One could tell by his demeanor that he simply didn't a damn anymore, becoming a king. An emperor? A light to the masses, a hero to the many? He couldn't be bothered to care. Simeon's soul construct rose to his feet and quickly helped raise Raj and Drake to the feet. Placing them on the platform before putting it on his own back and respectfully waiting for Lionel, Lionel stepped forward without a word. Vanishing in the blink of an eye, Simeon rushed after him. Vanishing into the dark clouds above like an obedient servant, not long later. The clouds slowly began to disperse and the wrath of the emperor vanished as well. Lionel's descent had brought thunder and darkness. His departure gave way to rays of sunlight. And yet the ominous atmosphere still hung. Omnipresent and resilient, Lionel's brothers stood with their fists still clenched, their tears rolling down their cheeks. They already knew that the Lionel they knew was longer among them. Lionel stepped onto his flagship with an indifferent expression. His heart didn't have the slightest fluctuation and his breath remained steady, even after wiping out 4 families. Committing what could only be described as mass genocide. His steps didn't feel any heavier. His shoulders didn't feel any more burdensome. Speak. Lionel said indifferently. There was only one person he could be talking to. And that was, of course, Simeon. The reason Lionel didn't care about Simeon's so-called information was because he could get it out of him whenever he wanted. With a soul in his possession, he was essentially under control of everything this person had ever known, and the most fearsome part was that they had no ability to resist. In this state, Lionel's emperor's charm was its absolute strongest and his charisma was on a completely different level. Not only were his soul constructs sentient, they were also endlessly loyal. He had heard of others who had necromancer-like abilities. But he didn't have to deal with the restrictions many of them did. Outside of the initial investment of dream force and his willpower, he didn't need to invest anything else if he didn't want to. He could take control of hundreds of seventh-dimensional existences with ease before he felt any sort of burden, and that was because much of the strength needed came from the original soul owner to begin with. Lionel's only job was to give the soul form and stop it from dissipating. In fact, he didn't even need to invest stamina into control, as that was all done passively by his Emperor's charm. On top of that, if he really wanted to control them, he could, using his intelligence to make efficient use of their power. But in most cases, it was better to simply allow them to fight with their usual battle style, something they were the most familiar with. Of course, there were problems as well, these weaknesses coming from the fact that Lionel didn't have access to Emperor's Command, Breathe, and Emperor's Command, Assimilate. Currently, Lionel could only stop these souls from dissipating for a single day. After a 24-hour period, no matter what he did, even if he tried to use the Arise command again, it would be useless. This was why among the seventh-dimensional soul constructs he came with, he only had Aderna family members, as they were the last he destroyed before he came back to Earth. If Lionel's assumption was correct, the Breathe command should be a method of tethering a soul to the real world on a more permanent basis. Without it, Lionel would always be limited in this way. In addition, as the soul constructs took damage, this 24-hour period was fed upon to reform it, thus cutting it down further. Depending on the damage, more time was lost. This was simply how things went. There was no technique or ability in existence without any drawbacks. Yes, Your Imperial Highness. My inferior self wanted to use information about the Brazinger family and the other great families as a bargaining chip. The first thing my inferior self wanted to let Imperial Highness know was that among the number killed, Your Imperial Highness Empress' worst enemy was not among them. The woman, Imperatrice Anselma, is hidden within a special realm of the Brazinger family. The second thing my inferior self wanted Imperial Highness to know is the existence of these special realms. The current showing of the great families is nothing more than the tip of the iceberg. This inferior servant status is lowly and does not know much else, but what this inferior servant does know is that there are certain rules and restrictions restraining the great families from acting as they please. Chapter 1765. Published at 10th of April 2023, 11:03 and 59 seconds AM. Chapter 1765. Smoothly. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Where are these hidden realms? This servant does not know, Your Imperial Highness. Have you never been there? I have, Your Imperial Highness, and I can enter as I please. However, this method relies on my fleshly body and I will not be recognized in this state. You can enter freely, but you do not know where it is? Correct, Your Imperial Highness. So long as I or any member of the great families had been within Earth's jurisdiction, we could enter. And why is it that you didn't use this method to escape when you couldn't escape from my hands? This lowly servant was unable to due to certain restrictions, Your Imperial Highness. The process requires time and can be easily interrupted by outside influences. Lionel could only lay down the killing intent in his heart for now. If there was no method, then it seemed that his killing spree would have to pause here, for now, if this lowly one might be presumptuous. Your Imperial Highness. Speak, Lionel said indifferently, somewhat knowing what Simeon wanted to say. This lowly servant is lowly even among the Brazingers. Lionel nodded to himself. He had already guessed this. Back when he faced the patrol leader, he had deduced that Simeon was far too weak for the kind of status he seemed to have. The reason this lowly servant was able to demand some prestige is because of who my father is. My father and siblings all command great strength within the Brazinger family. However, while my ability index is good, my body has always been weak and I was thus tasked with overseeing things on the outside and I was not privy to many secrets. However, this lowly servant does know some things. For example, the main family seems to have specifically bred the Brazingers on the outside to perform certain tasks. If this lowly one's understanding is correct, then Brazinger family members with a certain level of potency of lineage factor cannot exist the hidden realm, a step further than that. If this lowly one is correct, then the potency is decided by the level of Earth. The stronger Earth's territory becomes, The stronger members of the Brazinger family and other great families can make their presences known. As for why this is, this lowly one does not know or understand. But what this servant can tell your Imperial Highness is that the last time the great family sent out a large contingent was after Earth's sixth-dimensional evolution. They have yet to do so since Earth entered the seventh dimension because it was deemed unnecessary, with your Imperial Highness's actions. However, Simeon's soul construct froze, a wild ripple fluctuating through it and nearly causing it to collapse entirely, never to return. A malevolent aura rolled off of Lionel in waves. Good, he said in a soft voice that somehow caused the flagship to quake. The more they send, the better. My blade hasn't been satisfied yet. Simeon shivered, but his gaze was filled with fanaticism. If it wasn't because he knew well that his Imperial Highness was disgusted with him, he would have knelt down and kissed his feet. Imperial Highness will be sure to crush them all. Simeon roared out beside himself, supporting Lionel's momentum. The members of the Brazinger family are powerful, but they will be no match for your Highness. Lionel didn't respond to Simeon. He felt no need to. If the Brazingers they had sent out for the sixth-dimensional evolution of Earth were already so powerful, there was no need to talk about the kind of monsters they had in reserve. However, Lionel wanted them to come. Whether it was for Aina or his brothers, he hadn't let enough blood rain yet. Put them down, Lionel said coldly. Simeon hurried to follow Lionel's orders, placing the platform above his head on the ground carefully. Bring out the others. Simeon understood what Lionel meant without explanation, the benefit of a soul construct. Quickly, he brought Lionel's other brothers. As expected, he had gotten them all. Milan, Franco, and Gil came out and stood beside Raj and Drake, all of them having the very same dull gaze. This was exactly why Lionel had said that Simeon was lucky. If he hadn't done this, Lionel would have showed him just how cruel he could be. As far as Lionel was concerned, being burned alive was a show of mercy on his part. Under normal circumstances, Lionel would be helpless to do anything. However, because the corpses of his 4 brothers had been preserved and manipulated by Simeon, small portions of their souls were still present and had yet to dissipate. As a result, Lionel flipped over a palm and the silver tablet appeared. With this, he could bring the 5 of them back. If their souls had dissipated, even the silver tablet would be able to do nothing. But by a twist of fate, all thanks to Simeon's sadistic actions, his brothers had a chance. Rise, Lionel commanded. As Lionel yearned to bring his brothers back, news of his actions during the last few days finally began to circulate before they made it back to a particular man, Patriarch Guerreros, the leader of the chaotic water sector. He did what? Guerreros sat up entirely, his pupils constricted into pinholes. It took him a long time to calm down, his heart still beating erratically even in the end. But, he still maintained his rationality, remembering the kind of backing and trump cards he had in his hands. So he used the flagship to commit murder, correct? That's exactly the smoking gun we need. To think that I didn't need those schemes at all, he went and did it himself. Let Cross Elder Avens know that he can it personally. He doesn't need to touch Lionel at all, just retrieve the flagship, everything will be simple after that. Lionel had scanned the flagship from head to toe, there simply weren't any tracking devices, nor any methods of directly coming to him. But there was one failsafe that he couldn't see through even if he knew it was there, one hidden within its nuclear fusion core. Just probing the general vicinity was too difficult and could damage his soul, let alone if he tried to reach its hidden depths where this mechanism was hidden. Shield Cross Stars was a protector of humanity, they couldn't allow rogue officers to do as they pleased. As such, whenever one of their warships was used to kill, there was a method of marking down exactly what happened and relaying it to the Shield Cross Stars upper management. This was meant to fight against corruption. In order to stop powerful officers who were often in control of such mechanisms from hiding their actions, the failsafe was tied to the power core itself. Every time an attack was powered, the core would register it. If a death was noted, it would be permanently recorded. The process of sending this information back to the Shield Cross Stars headquarters would reveal the position of the flagship, but most importantly, a Cross Elder would be able to act directly. This was exactly what Guerrero's wanted. Once this was done, the next step of Guerrero's plan would flow all too smoothly. Chapter 1766. Published at 10th of April 2023 11:03 and 57 seconds AM. Chapter 1766. Quake if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel's dream force surged, enveloping the puppet forms of his brothers. His face immediately went pale under the strain, compared to resurrecting a soul that had just fallen in this. The difficulty was several orders of magnitude separated. In that instant, Lionel didn't hesitate to purge the souls he still had under his control. They would only last for a few more hours regardless. Between that and his brothers, the answer was all too obvious. The only one he kept in his possession was Simeon because he still hadn't finished asking all the questions he needed to just yet. Slowly, Lionel extricated what remained of his brother's soul, slowly nurturing them to the point they became whole once more, but rather than taking the final step and giving them form, he brought the silver tablet forward. Lionel wasn't actually sure if this would work. From what he originally knew about the silver, it was only designed to be used with the zone in specific. He had tried to experiment with it before, but it had no reaction in the face of death. However, the Lionel of the past and the current Lionel were vastly different. Now, he could directly control soul, theoretically. The reaction the silver tablet had now should be different from the past, if the souls were provided to it, instead of just a normal corpse. There was no reason why it would react differently. With Lionel's current perspective, he knew that the constructs hidden within the silver tablet were actually just souls that the silver tablet was preserving. Somehow the silver tablet could replicate some of the abilities of the Emperor's might lineage factor, and seemingly with even far greater ease. It only made Lionel more curious as to the true origins of this tablet. Lionel's pupils suddenly constricted. He sensed it right then. The silver tablet had reached some sort of peak capacity. If he wanted to use it on his brothers, he would need to. Lionel hadn't expected this. The souls of his brothers had actually all reached the 7th dimension already, and this very clearly placed a great amount of strain on the silver tablet. In fact, Lionel had a feeling that this was probably the limit of the silver tablet. But this only made sense. Ana's father had a bronze tablet that seemingly had the exact same functions. There had to be something that separated them, and this seemed to be it. If Lionel was correct, the limit of the silver tablet was probably in preserving and resurrecting 7th-dimensional souls. Lionel's expression went cold. He knew his decision would kill the souls that remained in the silver tablet, but he didn't hesitate to make the choice. With a thought, he allowed his brother's souls into the silver tablet, causing large swaths of the remaining souls within to disperse one after another. Anastasia. Convert the remaining resources into pure neutral chi. The remaining resources Lionel was referring to were the raw ores and force crystals he had managed to save in constructing his divine armors by making use of the abilities of the cleansing waters. He ended up needing less than half of the resources he had traded for back then, and now they would come in handy in bringing his brothers back to him. The segmented cube was still a finger sleeve on Lionel's hand, so it wasn't difficult for Lionel to access it and communicate with Anastasia. In just a few moments, a concentrated stream of pure energy began to emit from his finger, pouring into the silver tablet. Lionel watched with a gaze as steely as cool metal, his heartbeat steady. If this worked, then everything would be fine. If it didn't, he would show those so-called great families true pain. He didn't care what their true origin was. He would bury them all. The silver tablet trembled and 5 beams of light shot out, motes of light rotating and quickly taking form. Only when Lionel saw this did he breathe a slight breath of relief, but even then, there was still a hint of trepidation within him. It was one thing to bring the likes of Elthar or his King Oryx's father back to life. After all, Lionel didn't have much interaction with them. However, he was far more worried about this. What if they were no longer the same? Was life and death really so easy to play around with? And what about the state of the souls? What if the issues they had were due to this forced method he was using? With Lionel's speed of thought, he thought of dozens of potential issues per breath, and they only seemed to snowball into larger and larger problems until he stopped breathing entirely. One after another, the motes of light solidified into 5 bodies that slowly opened their eyes one after another. The five looked around and met each other's gazes first, seemingly in a daze. Raj blinked, locking eyes with Milan before he jumped so high his head nearly hit the ceiling, his rotund stomach rolling in waves. Fuck. Ghost. Ghost? Milan was confused for a second before he looked down at himself and then back up again. Suddenly, he felt enraged for no reason. Who the hell's the ghost? You're the ghost. Are you trying to curse me to death? Milan swiped at the air and jumping Raj suddenly found a bubble of force surrounding him. The bubble of force shook wildly, causing Raj to bounce around and end up too dizzy to see straight. Let me out, you ghost. Damn it. Raj roared and a strong surge of earth force shot out in all directions. Call me a ghost one more time, Jigglytubby. Fuck, you're here too, rabbit ears? Gil was so distracted by Raj and Milan that he only now noticed that Franco was right next to him. Why are you naked? Even if you want to be a pervert, there should be a limit, right? Franco was speechless before he suddenly mumbled to himself. Did I end up in the same fiery pit as this idiot? No way, I had more karma than that. Where's God? I have a few words for him. Which pair of eyes did he use to judge my life? What the fuck is this? Probably the same pair of eyes that saw you fuck Marcy's sister while she was downstairs having an argument with her parents about you, Gil jabbed back. He saw that and still put me here? That should have been in my highlight reel. Drake was the most silent of them all, but when he looked around and his eyes landed on Lionel, they couldn't help but open wide. Captain. The sudden yell snapped them all awake and their heads snapped toward Lionel all at once. Lionel was stunned for a moment as well before he suddenly burst into a laughter that rocked the entire flagship. He laughed so hard that tears threatened to spill from his eyes. Other than his brothers, who else would react like this after snubbing death? They didn't even waste any time before they were suddenly at each other's throats. They didn't even notice his presence. Just when Lionel wanted to say something more, the entire flagship quaked, but this time, he was sure it had nothing to do with his laughter. Chapter 1767. Published at 10th of April 2023 11:03 and 57 seconds AM. Chapter 1767. Change if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Lionel and his brothers looked up all at once. Their expressions turning cold all at once. Lionel was immediately infuriated. His brothers had just come back to him, and yet instead of having some time to catch up, some fool who didn't know better was already threatening them. There didn't seem to be even a single moment of rest for him. The six brothers' gazes met and they all shot toward the outside of the flagship all at once, nothing really caring about their clothing. Even the most clothed among them, Lionel, was practically naked given the ragged state of his clothing. None of this, though, was able to slow their steps when they made it outside. Lionel's pupils constricted. The force barrier protecting the flagship was already in a heavily damaged state, seemingly just an attack or two away from collapsing entirely. In the skies, an old man with a fluttering mustache. Just seeing him, Lionel felt his heart palpitate. This man was the strongest existence he had ever been so close to. The difference was so large that it felt as though an oppressive mountain was weighing down on his shoulders. However, even while Lionel was thinking this, the expression of Cross Elder Avon was incredibly ugly. It should have taken him only a single strike to pierce through the barrier. But he had already attacked twice and yet it was still up. What the hell was going on? Of course, in order to enter Earth's territory, Avon had to suffer a suppression of his strength. After all, he wasn't an Earthling. Nor was he born in any of the territories it had recently swallowed up. However, Shield Cross Stars had fail-safe measures to deal with situations like this. The badge on his hip currently was designed to directly shut down the flagship and strip its control away from Lionel. With this badge, it should have only taken him a single strike to pierce through its defenses and the attacks of the flagship would be useless against him. And yet things had clearly not worked out properly. Cross Elder Avon realized at that moment that if the badge didn't work on the force barrier, then didn't that mean that it wouldn't work in protecting him against the flagship's attacks as well? Lionel's gaze narrowed. His fragmented Bao domain lineage factor immediately activating as he locked eyes with the badge. He noticed its oddities almost immediately. Lionel had seen through a lot of the countermeasures of shield cross stars and he had undone them all, or so he thought. The fact a single seventh-dimensional existence could crack the force barrier like this must mean that his countermeasures weren't as perfect as he thought. The energy core. Lionel immediately deduced the issue. He had turned the entire flagship on its head and he had a perfect replica of each one of its individual parts down to the small bolt. There was only one location where such a countermeasure could possibly be hidden, the nuclear fusion core. Toward this, Lionel was helpless to do anything. Modifying that region was too dangerous. There's a chance that this old man has more strength than what he's showing as well. And if that's true, Lionel's expression turned cold and he waved a hand. In that moment, the number of clones he had in the flagship more than tripled, in an instant. The cannons aimed in the skies and pulsed. Prepare to fire, fuck. Cross Elder Avon's eyes widened. When he heard that Lionel was able to precision aim the cannons of the flagship to target individuals on a one-person scale, he had found it ridiculous. The flagship was designed to aim at other warships, asteroids and planets. The margin for error was too large to think of aiming for a single person. Doing so was like trying to use a blow dart to kill a fly from 100 kilometers away. Such a level of precision was simply impossible, especially not when the target could move. So why did Avon suddenly feel the scent of death? Boom! The cannons unleashed and Cross Elder Avon roared, slapping his palms together and allowing a tsunami of force to envelop him from all sides. Lionel's gaze narrowed. This was the same ability index that Milan had, the Energy Shield Ability Index. But at this level, it was a completely different monster. Boom! The man was swallowed whole by the beams of blinding light as the starry skies illuminated. Lionel's eyes narrowed. The power is only 10% of what it should be. As expected, the core of it all is in the nuclear fusion core. It's been compromised. Somehow, the energy that comes from it is being mutated, disallowing it from harming those with that badge. If not for the modifications I made, it wouldn't have even have 10% left. As the beam cleared, Cross Elder Avon appeared, shielded behind a mighty force barrier that almost looked corporeal. It floated with runes dancing across its surface. It truly seemed as though it was alive. Cross Elder Avon's fiery temper threatened to spill over, plumes of fire flickering within the depths of his eyes. His barrier quaked slightly, but there wasn't a single crack on it. It was clear that he had weathered its strength without much issue. If not for him being caught off guard by the rumors being true, he wouldn't have been flustered in the first place. However, in the time it took him to form his defenses, the cracked barriers of the flagship had recovered. Lionel stood with a cold expression, his mind churning. He didn't actually believe that his father's threat would give him some omnipresent and omnidirectional protection. However, he was still somewhat shocked that someone would dare to attack him so openly like this, and especially while he was so close to Earth. In addition, this person seemed to be from Shield Cross Stars. How bold. Something's changed, there must be something this person is relying on. If not, why not just use the Patriarch of the Chaotic Water Sector to find my location and use that badge to take me out much earlier? Why wait until now? Unless, who the hell are you? Lionel asked coldly. Chapter 1768. Published at 10th of April 2023 11:03 and 54 seconds AM. Chapter 1768. Blame if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Cross Elder Avon's expression wasn't good being questioned by a junior so rudely. He didn't expect to be placed in this situation to begin with. According to his original intentions, he would have already been on the flagship by now, teaching Lionel a lesson. He would have conveniently taken the opportunity to capture Lionel back. But now, Your Imperial Highness, this man should be Cross Elder Avon of Shield Cross Stars. His status is very high. He is an 8th dimensional expert and he can almost make unilateral decisions in regards to the movements of Shield Cross Stars. At that moment, Simeon's soul construct suddenly spoke, causing Lionel's gaze to narrow even further. As he had expected, Cross Elder Avon was a true powerhouse. The human domain didn't have any 8th dimensional worlds, as such, any 8th dimensional experts. usually had to use methods of restricting their own strength just to be able to stay in their homes. In addition, just crossing the barrier to the 8th dimension to begin with was a huge test in and of itself because it required leaving the human domain to succeed. The fact that Cross Elder Avon had succeeded not only gave him exceptionally high status among Shield Cross stars, but also among humans in general. The human race truly didn't have many experts of this caliber. The number was less than 100 in comparison to their population of trillions upon trillions. Lionel didn't bother to care about why Simeon knew of this for now. He would deal with one problem at a time. Dealing with such an expert would require his full attention. The first time Lionel met a 7th-dimensional expert as a 5th-dimensional expert himself was during his interaction with Wise Star Order. Back then, he had been entirely outclassed. Although Cross Elder Avon was restricted, there was no telling what kind of abilities he had. If not for the flagship, Lionel would have already been in his clutches. Brat, I would advise you hand over the flagship and obediently hand yourself in. Cap, this old man's more annoying than Coach. Look at the mustache. Is it a rite of passage for you legion of stick-up-the-ass old men to all have rats on your lips? Raj scoffed. At least Coach isn't bald. No wonder this old man's so jaded. Raj had no idea what had happened, nor did he understand the context. But he didn't care, even in the worst case that Lionel was in the wrong. He would just turn a blind eye. The moment he saw that mustache, he was already having flashbacks to running sprints under the beaming sun and he lashed out. Lionel, who was trying to be serious, couldn't help but smile. Cross Elder Avon's expression turned malevolent. He couldn't remember the last time someone had dared to talk to him like this, just as he was about to say something. A swirling portal of green gold appeared in the skies. Lionel's eyes widened. At that moment, a middle-aged man wearing robes embroidered with coiling 5-clawed dragons stepped out. His hands were clasped behind his back, his expression indifferent and unmoved as he appeared before Cross Elder Avon. Now that Lionel thought about it, this was the first time he had ever seen his grandfather upright, let alone moving. Every time they had met, he was either sitting in meditation or seated on a throne. And the difference, it was striking. Emperor Fox's every movement seemed to cause the laws of the world to shimmer and bend, even the dragons on his imperial robes seeming far more alive. Without a word, Emperor Fox stood just a single meter from Cross Elder Avon. The difference in their height was striking, with Avon being a full head shorter, although much stockier. Emperor Fox's head suddenly turned and he looked toward Earth that loomed in the nearby distance. It seemed that he was checking if he wasn't crazy. Indeed, his imperial palace was within sight, and yet this person had still come here, in his territory, to stir trouble. Emperor Fox's head turned back toward Cross Elder Avon. Leave, Emperor Fox said lightly. His robes fluttered as he looked down toward Avon, the lack of wind seemingly not mattering in the slightest. You. Avon's eyes widened with fury. However, before he could speak, a blinding gold light appeared to Emperor Fox's back as a scroll slowly unfurled. I said, leave. The entirety of Earth's territory trembled and Lionel's eyes opened wide. In the blink of an eye, Cross Elder Avon's vanished to places seemingly unknown. And yet Lionel was absolutely certain that he was exported out of Earth's territory entire with a single spoken word. His grandfather's range of control was so large. Emperor Fox casually turned back toward Lionel, his expression indifferent. Don't you have a job to do? Get to it. Emperor Fox didn't seem to care to mention the massacre of the Brazingers that had occurred just moments ago. With a step, he vanished. Lionel fell into silence, his expression serious. So Shield Cross stars could find him if he used the flagship to kill, but that didn't change much. Somehow, the chaotic water sector was able to do the same thing. The real problem was that they had methods of weakening his flagship's power output and its defenses. If they really wanted to cause issues, just handing such methods to those causing trouble in Earth's territory would make the situation far more dangerous. Cross Elder Avon's flashed out of the void, his body sliding back in the depths of space until he came to a grinding halt. His clothing was disordered and his mustache bristled, a hint of shock in the depths of his eyes. He still couldn't quite wrap his head around what had just happened. This was supposed to be easy, just what had happened. Fury built up within his chest with nowhere to be vented. Good. 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 Then don't blame me, then. Chapter 1769. Published at 10th of April 2023 11:03 and 53 seconds AM. Chapter 1769. May if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel stood in silence for a moment before he looked around with a smile. The weight in his chest seemed to have been lowered somewhat. He didn't even care to consider what had happened in the last few days. He just felt content at the moment. His only regret was that his brothers had actually gone through so much growing without him. In this time, they had actually gone ahead and stepped into the seventh dimension well before him. This wasn't too surprising, though, given the talent of the people of Earth, not to mention the sheer number of resources Earth and its surrounding planets were spewing out constantly. It wasn't too shocking that they could reach such a stage relying on the conventional path, although it was slightly regretful that they hadn't taken the God path. Lionel could tell that they didn't have much of a choice in the matter. When Lionel last met them, they were only at the lower tiers of the fifth dimension. Between then and now, Earth had faced several existential crises. It wasn't as though they could take their time to grow in such a situation. Emno was definitely far luckier in this regard. Even so, as Lionel had learned long ago, taking the conventional path didn't guarantee one's weakness. If they reforged their foundations with the help of the demon corpses as well, their chances at squeezing out their full potential would skyrocket. Plus, the root of talent that separated the people of Earth from others came not from their base dimension, but rather their ability indexes. And from what Lionel could tell from their casual jokes from earlier, his brothers had refined their ability indexes to a shocking degree. Lionel's expression flickered for a moment and he vanished for a moment. When he reappeared, there were 3 more young men standing with him, all 3 of whom carried confused expressions until their eyes suddenly widened. Joel, Arnold and Alan weren't as wild with their reactions as the others would be. But even so, it took everything in them not to scream out, "Ghost," as well. Ah! Raj charged over and swept the 3 into a bear hug before they could react. The 3 couldn't even react. Their minds still ringing. Was this an illusion? Had they slipped into such a thing? It wasn't impossible. But hadn't they been in human territory? Unless that was an illusion too. It wasn't until they felt Raj's members swinging against their legs that they snapped out of it. Damn it, Raj. Put on some damn clothes. Joel suddenly roared, pushing away and taking 3 hurried steps back. Raj burst into laughter, his stomach jiggling, his hips gyrated as he rushed after Joel. His entire body seemed to roll in a circular pattern, the sickening slapping noise of skin echoing through the flagship. Don't run, Joel. You're hurting my feelings. Don't you love me? Fuck. Joel turned and booked it. Ever since he and Lionel got caught sleeping in each other's arms and got themselves printed onto a t-shirt, he had been trying his best to avoid moments like this. All his usual composure flew out of the window, and yet, even as he ran, his eyes turned red as a wild grin spread across his face. It took a while, but the brothers finally sat together once more, circling around a table with smiles on their faces. Really though, Cap, when'd you become a god? I'm kinda scared, Franco asked. Ah. Lionel scratched his head. Honestly, he was only 20% sure that his method would work. The greatest limitation he had thought the silver tablet had was that its resurrection ability would only work on the zone. But he had never thought that he would gain the ability to manipulate souls, which allowed him to circumvent that method. The only limitation he had to contend with now was the 7th dimension. It was a bit unfortunate that so many lives were permanently lost to give his brothers a chance to live again, but Lionel knew he would make the same choice again even if it was presented to him once more. It was no longer that difficult of a choice to him. Lionel didn't really know how to explain it, so he just laid out everything honestly. After his brothers heard the truth, they looked toward one another. Didn't that mean that so long as they had enough energy to exchange and their souls didn't disperse, they would be basically immortal until they died of natural causes? Of course, Lionel would have to stay alive since he was the only one who could manipulate souls, but this was definitely a game changer. And they couldn't enter the 8th dimension or else the silver tablet wouldn't be able to withstand their resurrection process. But this. It feels different from that as well, Drake suddenly said. He was the most conscientious of them all, so he noticed almost immediately. After I entered the 7th dimension, I felt like my progress had slowed to a crawl, but now it feels like all sorts of bottlenecks were suddenly opened up. Lionel's eyes flickered. This wasn't too surprising. The other ability of the silver tablet was clearing bottlenecks and allowing faster progression. After it rebuilt their bodies, it seemed that it had given them a path forward to progress faster as well. They were all in Tier 1 of the 7th dimension. In fact, even after many years, Joel, Arnold and Alan were only in Tier 2. But now, it seemed that there was another chance for them. Unfortunately, we don't have much time to tease out the details of right now. You guys must know that Earth is in a bit of trouble right now, some of which may or may not have been caused by me. Lionel rubbed his nose. The 9 brothers looked toward one another before bursting into a fit of laughter. May? A lot of it was definitely caused by Lionel, but did it matter? They were in this together. Chapter 1770. Published at 10th of April 2023 11:03 and 52 seconds AM. Chapter 1770. Big news: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Earth's territory, Etching Metal Organization. The situation in the Etching Metal Organization had been tense several days ago until the return of Emna, whereupon a shocking change took place. However, after this change settled down, the tension returned. This matter was inevitable. Emna, who had a high position in the hearts of the Etching Metal Organization, had placed her life on the line to give them a chance at the information they were seeking out, but even after returning in success, she had nothing to show for it, according to Emna. The impetus for the creation of their organization. A certain Lionel Morales that most of them had never even met before. Took the spoils of Emna's successful assassination to analyze himself. It was then said that he was meant to return to them in a few days. But even after that time period had passed, he had still not returned. Days ago, after Emna's return, many had already been dissatisfied with this. They didn't even know this Lionel. What right did he have to take their spoils? And now that he truly hadn't appeared after all this time, their dissatisfaction was only raised to an entirely new level. Could it be that he had simply lied and never planned to return at all? Everything came to a head and the commotion was raised to a large enough level that a meeting was forced to convene, at that moment, in an unknown location on an equally as unknown planet. This meeting had begun. The Etching Metal Organization had just one leader, Raylion, however. The power was dispersed across many heads, all of whom had their own thoughts, while there were some heads that Raylion could trust to be on his side like Hephaestus, Emna, and the most powerful among them, Sale. When Lionel last met Sale, he had lamented that her mentality wasn't strong enough to make use of her talent, despite being more talented than even Raylion. During their time in Valiant Heart Mountain, she had been constantly suppressed by him. And after Valiant Heart Mountain fell, while Raylion was able to forge ahead, she found herself broken and weak. Since then, however, Sale had managed to pick herself up, becoming a backbone of the organization and a large reason why the original foundation of the Etching Metal Organization hadn't lost sight of their original purpose. Sale was precisely the very woman that had introduced Lionel and Aina to Valiant Heart Mountain in the first place. She had been born with a unique ability index that had never been encoded before that gave her body a great mutation that amplified her battle prowess. It also happened to give her quite some control over plants and vegetation. Raylion had started the Etching Metal Organization with Hephaestus many years ago, but it wasn't until quite some time after that Sale managed to find her way back to them, and finally, many years after that, she and Raylion finally knocked down the last barriers separating the two and became husband and wife, solidifying their control over the organization. Wink with a frown. Author's note. It's been a while, so I know the nuances of this relationship are probably hard to remember. If it matters to you to remember and not just have it retold to you, I would suggest reading the last few chapters before the fall of Valiant Heart Mountain again, as these details will be more important than they seem. Chap 915-19. Anywho, back to the story. Still, over the years, in order to expand the power of the Etching Metal Organization, Raylion had no choice but to recruit and delegate power for an organization that lingered in the shadows and collected information while working in the morally gray hues of the world, being able to form numerous limbs that could work independently of one another while maintaining a certain level of strength and quality was greatly important. However, in order to accomplish this, one also had to accept working with a double-edged sword. In releasing some of the absolute control he had, Raylion had to swallow a lot more pushback and dissenting opinions, especially in recent days. It was to the point where many were questioning the original reason the organization was formed in the first place. Due to this, the room was split down the middle in two. On one side, there was Raylion, Sale, Alcestis and Emna, but on the other, there were 4 other individuals. Crafter Bittner. This old man was the best crafter among their numbers, being at the silver grade. He was very much responsible for outfitting a large number of their assassins, warriors and operatives with the tools and treasures they needed, especially at the highest levels. Treasurer Gemsi. He was a savant when it came to not only accounting, but also in money laundering and moving around dark money. Without him, their growth would have been bottlenecked over a decade ago. How could an organization grow without money? But this was an especially tall task to fulfill for an organization that functioned in the dark like theirs, especially when Raylion refused to take on casual assassination missions that would have been the most lucrative. Then there was Robin and Tiny, the former being a woman and the latter being a man that was, quite frankly, tiny. Robin was a tall and muscular woman whose neck was swallowed up by her traps, while Tiny was a man of not even 5 feet tall who had irises so large and black that the whites of his eyes almost vanished entirely. However, their combat prowess was exceptional and they were the pillars of strength of their organization outside of Raylion, Sale, Alcestis and Emna. At this moment, Crafter Bittner, Treasurer Gemsi, Robin and Tiny sat across from the 4 somewhat founding members of the organization, questioning the recent happenings quite fiercely. This old narrative is getting tiring, Tiny spoke in a voice several octaves too deep given his size. It has been over 20 years since the organization was founded and we've been waiting for this so-called Lionel to appear for all this time, and once he finally does, he screws us over? Is this what you've had us waiting all this time for? You refuse to expand beyond Earth's territory even though this is by far the most dangerous region to do business in the human domain currently. You refuse to accept assassination missions that aren't hand-picked and curated even though Gemsi is barely keeping us afloat money-wise. And now our apparent savior is some Tier 1 6th-dimensional brat? Emna's expression darkened. Tier 1 of the 6th dimension is too weak for you? Am I too weak for you too? We've already had this conversation, Emna. You dealt the man a fatal blow and he was already greatly weakened. He just swooped in after you had already done all the work and you went googly-eyed, even giving him our spoils of war. Shouldn't you be answering for that? I put my life on the line to complete that mission, but you want me to give you an answer for it? Emna's gaze danced with flickering blade lights. Haha. Tiny roared with laughter. You might have completed the mission, but who gave you the information on where that convenience station was? Who got the information of what that man's status was and what his goals were? How many of our brothers and sisters died before we could gather up that information? We've been in business for more than 20 years but we've only unearthed 3 of those locations, and yet you pissed it all away the moment you saw that incompetent fool. Now there's only 2 left and they'll probably be on guard. There's no telling if the information would remain the same, and even if it did, there's no telling if you'll succeed this time. If you can't see the problem with that, you don't deserve your position. You. Emna's hair stood on end, blade edges dancing within it. It seemed as though her individual strands had become blade force. Just as the atmosphere was about to boil over, there was a rushed knocking and an attendant stumbled in. Big news. Big news. Our informants just reported that the Aderna, Brazinger, Lavis and Crutus families have all been destroyed. Through their huffing and puffing, the attendant managed to breathe these words out. The 8 heads were left stunned. Chapter 1771. Published at 14th of April 2023 11:29 and 35 seconds AM. Chapter 1771. If audio player doesn't work, Press stop then play button again. Chapter 1771. Interesting analysis. A silence fell over the group as the report settled in. They were first and foremost an information network. It could be said that they were definitely among the very first to get this information, and yet, rather than information trickling in one at a time, they actually got it all at once. They didn't even get any information about any armies setting in. What the hell happened? P Alpha and D Alpha. No one. Oh, Tiny stood to his feet, his shock making his heart palpitate. This was the kind of information they should have gotten even before it happened. How could a force hide from them for so long? It made their hearts run cold. Raylion, who had been completely silent all the while, suddenly narrowed his eyes, but at the moment, his gaze was actually focused on Tiny. Not the messenger. It was hard to tell what was going on in his mind. His expression just as cold and indifferent as usual, at the same time. Hephaestus, who had likewise been silent, slowly released his grip on the dagger by his side. Tiny seemed to have no idea just how close Hephaestus was from exploding. It could even be said that the messenger stopped things from getting overblown. There. The attendant took heaving breaths, trying to calm themselves, in order to get this information here. They had really gone all out. There was little information about the first three. But according to our informants near Earth, a Prince Lionel of the Ascension Empire appeared with a flagship of shield cross stars and wiped them out single-handedly. At this point, even Raylion's expression changed somewhat. Was this a coincidence? Prince Lionel? Suddenly, things slid into place one by one. The Lionel they knew was an heir of the Morales family. But if he was also a prince of the Ascension Empire, things would make much more sense. In fact, had they known this beforehand, a lot of the trouble their organization had gone through would have never festered to begin with. The Morales were simply too far away from their location. And because Raylion wanted to focus their attention on Earth's empire, the information they had on the outside was limited. As such, the prestige the Morales had in the hearts of their members was far too low for what they were. In comparison, the prestige of the four families and the Ascension Empire, in addition to certain other families and faiths, were much higher. They had known that Lionel was from Earth, but they hadn't known what kind of status he had on Earth. If they were aware, maybe things would have never devolved to this state. Prince Lionel? Tiny and the other three who weren't very familiar with Lionel to begin with didn't immediately make the connection. The human domain was too vast. How could some people not share names? Plus, the Lionel Emna and the others were referring to had the Morales last name, not Fox, which they associated with the imperial family. However, they froze when the attendant confirmed. Yes, a Prince Lionel Morales. He is the son of Princess Eleanor Morales. There is news from the wider human domain that the reason for the sudden activity of the underground networks of Shield Cross Stars is because Princess Eleanor was infuriated by SCS labeling her son as a Tier 1 fugitive. Tiny forgot to breathe, his head slowly turning toward Emna and the others. Was this attendant trying to say that the Tier 1 six-dimensional existence he had just been lambasting wiped out four families their organization had no method to take head-on? Hephaestus suddenly laughed. That bastard is just as annoying as I remember. He pretends to be such a good person, and then he turns around and wipes out four families. It was his fault Valiant Heart Mountain fell so quickly too, but he just patted his ass and shrugged at that too. Raylion's gaze flickered as Sale's own danced with a complicated expression. Hephaestus wasn't wrong. For a long time, Sale felt guilty because it was she who invited Lionel to Valiant Heart Mountain to begin with. If not for what happened back then, they could have survived a few more centuries at least. They could have even used Earth's evolution as a method of turning their fate around. After all, they had been in Earth's quadrant to begin with, so they would have been the first to benefit. But in the end, things hadn't worked out that way. Emna was the most shocked among them all because she knew exactly what had caused this. She could still remember Lionel's rage when she informed him of what happened to his brothers. She even remembered hoping that he didn't do anything stupid. To think that he would get his revenge in just a few days, so quickly that even they were late to react. It took a while, but Tiny, Robin, and the other two finally calmed, looking toward one another. Tiny eventually took a seat as well, his expression flickering intermittently. He couldn't seem to decide what he should be thinking. Emna looked up, her own gaze cold. Do you have anything else to say now, Tiny? Tiny took a breath and exhaled, but before he could respond, it was actually Treasurer Jemsi who answered first. Do you all think that this concludes things? He suddenly said. Jemsi wasn't one to speak often, his eyes were usually glazed behind a pair of glasses. It seemed as though he was always calculating something, as though the outside world was of no interest whatsoever. However, the moment he did speak, everyone looked toward him. He is already a Tier 1 fugitive, and now he's used Shield Cross Star's weaponry to wipe out not just one, but 4 families of Earth. If his only identity was that of a prince of the Ascension Empire, things would be fine. However, his last name is Morales, not Fox. I'm sure if you all take a moment to think about it, you'll see what the problem is. Suddenly, due to his actions, competition over Earth's main resources have all been eradicated. It won't just be Shield Cross Stars that's unhappy about this. Interesting analysis. The sudden voice came from nowhere. This time, it wasn't just Tiny who stood to his feet, wary gazes looking toward the entrance. Chapter 1772. Published at 14th of April 2023 11:29 and 36 seconds AM. Chapter 1772. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1772. 2 choices. Lionel and his brothers slowly walked into the meeting room, Lionel himself at the helm. They seemed to appear from nowhere, and they hadn't even alerted anyone until they spoke toward this. Even Emna was surprised. She had told Lionel how to find them, but she hadn't expected him to enter the depths of their territory without anyone even noticing. The attendant was deathly pale. The moment Lionel stopped hiding his presence, the pressure was suffocating. Even Jemsi, who always maintained his calm, felt his throat constrict. Suddenly, the pressure vanished as Lionel grinned. Long time no see. Lionel laughed as he looked toward Hephaestus, Raylion and Sale. It couldn't be said that he had a deep relationship with all 3 of them, but he had good impressions of Sale, although she was a bit naive. At the same time, he quite respected Raylion. As for Hephaestus, he respected him as well, if for nothing other than his loyalty to Raylion. Suddenly, Lionel felt a vicious wind assault him, even as it pierced toward his throat. An afterimage of Hephaestus slowly dissipated into the wind. A malicious intent swallowing him up whole. Shing. Shying. Clang. Boom. P alpha and D alpha. No one. Oh, wild winds spread in all directions. Strong blade forces lashing out against the walls of the meeting room and leaving deep grooves everywhere they passed. Lionel's clothing fluttered, his fingers raised in a pinching motion. Between them, a blade was stopped mere inches from his neck, an amused light in his eye. Hephaestus' forearm bulged with wiggling veins that pulsed like flood dragons. His face went red beneath the strain. But he couldn't move forward even a single inch. What's this? Hephaestus? You aren't happy to see me? How's your diet been? Were you so weak? Hephaestus' lip twitched before he snorted and pulled back his blade. Hiding his trembling wrist to his back, he was already in Tier 9 of the 6th dimension. But his all-out attack had actually been stopped by 2 fingers, while he hadn't used his ability index. That was still at least 50% of his strength in that single assault. The fact Lionel had stopped it so casually went to show the sheer gap between them. My diet? Hephaestus snorted. I went easy on you, consider this a welcome gift. Lionel laughed. He remembered Hephaestus' ability index quite well. He could gain the characteristics of what he ate. The trouble was that the more talent he wanted to extract, and the more talented his target, the more of it he needed, for someone like Hephaestus. Especially since he left the evolution of the tentacle womb up to Anastasia. He probably had the highest ceiling of anyone here outside of Emna, who was only a measure away from forging her own path. All Lionel had to do was feed him a large number of demon corpses. Lionel looked towards Sale and blinked. Maybe not. Lionel hadn't expected that Emna wouldn't be the only one who was a real spark here. To think that Sale would be a real spark too, it was quite ironic. The original strongest amongst them, Raylion, actually seemed to have the least potential now. However, when Lionel looked into Raylion's eyes, he could see the very same fire he had seen back then. He might not have gotten the same opportunities as the rest of them, but his heart is still firm. That is more than worthy of praise. Lionel nodded toward Raylion lightly. For a man like this, he didn't need to say anything more. Raylion didn't need thanks, the only acknowledgement he needed were the fruits of his labor blooming, and Lionel would make certain that that happened. After Lionel greeted the 4 heads he was familiar with one by one, he finally turned his attention toward the remaining 4. They were all looking toward him with gazes ranging from wary to somewhat curious. I don't have much time to stay here today because there are still 3 major incidents that I was delayed from handling, but I can say that this man here isn't wrong. There will indeed be trouble for my actions, but the real question is how much it matters to you. Before you, there are 2 options. One is obedience, the other is death. There is no third option. Which will you choose? Lionel's smile vanished, his oppressive aura returning. The 4 suddenly felt small. Their force was sluggish and their breathing labored. Suddenly, they realized that Lionel wasn't alone. The aura of 8 seventh-dimensional powerhouses flooded the room and their eyes opened wide. It was only at that moment that Emna realized that 5 men that should have been dead were standing before her safe and sound. Treasurer Jemsi took deep breaths, trying to calm himself. You are very strong, but have you truly thought about this? This will no longer be a matter of just shield cross stars. Your actions are an opportunity for almost every family of the human domain to stick their noses into the matters of Earth. I don't need you to explain these things to me. If you can think of it, I thought of it 100 times faster. You may be used to being the smartest person in the room, but I can tell you now that your greatest pride is useless before me. I won't repeat myself again. Make your choice, Lionel said coldly. Ha. Treasurer Jemsi chuckled. Do I really have a choice at all? I don't want to die. Good, Lionel said indifferently. At that moment, a mighty golden light raised up behind him, a radiant scroll unfurling. Lionel's gaze glowed with a fierce light and he pierced out his finger 4 times in a row. The 4 heads shuddered. Although they couldn't see it, in each of their ethereal glabellas, they had all gained an imperial edict. So long as they dared to disobey it, the ethereal glabellas would self-destruct. This ability was a fusion of Emperor's Gaze and Emperor's Edict known as Emperor's Mark. Lionel had deduced it on his own without the Emperor's Might tablet because his comprehension of its 2 halves were absolutely perfect. This would also make certain things far more convenient for him. Now, like I said, I don't have much time. The 3 most pressing issues are the Zoltine Faith, the Thrusting Skies sector and the re-emergence of the Viola family. I need information about these 3 as things don't seem so simple. Chapter 1773. Published at 14th of April 2023 11:29 and 36 seconds AM. Chapter 1773. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1773. Glorious Zolti. Not long later, Lionel left with his brothers, leaving a few words for the etching metal organization. He saw no reason not to trust Raylion and the others. While he placed his Emperor's Mark on Jemsi and the other 3 heads, there was no way he would do the same to the 4 founding heads. It seems we didn't waste our time, Hephaestus said. After a long while, he had a wild grin on his face. He remembered the first time he met Lionel. He could have beaten him any time he wanted, but just months later, he was already incapable of lasting a few blows, and now, decades later, to say that Lionel could defeat him with a single strike wasn't giving Lionel enough credit. P Alpha D Alpha. No one. Raylion didn't say anything to this. But he felt Sale's small hand slip into his own, while Raylion didn't show any sort of emotion. Sale understood him the best. There was no one here who wanted this result more than Raylion himself. Even as they all surpassed Raylion one after another, Sale knew that Raylion had never given up on becoming a powerful expert. Unfortunately, his talent was just lacking in comparison to the others. He had gone from the head disciple of Valiant Heart Mountain to ultimately being an administrative leader of the organization. Raylion knew that if he wanted to achieve his dreams, Lionel was his only hope, but his pride was far too deep. He refused to hold his hands out, hoping that Lionel would just do him a favor. He had no relationship with Lionel, and they had even once been enemies. And even if they had been friends, Raylion would never feel comfortable asking for something when he could give nothing in return. During these over 20 years he had put his blood, sweat and tears into this organization, doing everything he could so that he could look Lionel in the eyes and exchange not for his charity, but for what he deserved. He had spent every waking moment thinking and dreaming on. This day, his effort would finally pay off. Raylion squeezed Sale's hand lightly and his gaze turned toward Tiny. Tiny, he said lightly. Tiny, whose expression was ugly after being essentially branded like cattle by Lionel, suddenly snapped awake when he met Raylion's gaze. For some reason, he felt his heart skip a beat. He had always subconsciously feared this man, but he never truly understood why. What did they promise you? Tiny? Tiny froze before quickly recovering. What are you talking about, Raylion? The 4 families, what did they promise you? Raylion replied just as calmly, his eyes even being half closed. Hearing this, Tiny turned entirely pale. He wanted to refuse it, but when he remembered the Emperor's mark hovering in his ethereal glabella, he knew that there was no longer any point. Raylion must have been sitting on this information for a long time waiting for the perfect opportunity, but since Lionel had appeared, he didn't have to be subtle and sly with everything anymore. This was the difference between scheming and true strength. Tiny could do nothing in the face of Lionel's overwhelming means. Tiny grit his teeth. I will give you all the information and benefits I received. Good, Raylion replied lightly. You have 3 days. I assume with this that we will see a 150% boost in revenue and the effectiveness of our network. Since we won't be shooting ourselves in the foot anymore, I expect us to be in peak form within the week in time for Lionel's return. Raylion stood to his feet, holding on to Sale's hand. Our goal is beyond this. Very soon we will be on the world stage. As the founder of the Etching Metal organization, I officially announce that our first growth phase has come to an end. Our goal of becoming the best information network of the human domain has been successful. Our next goal is as follows: to make Lionel Morales the official heir of the Morales family. The teleportation formation flashed and a group of 9 appeared. Lionel looked around and sighed. What's wrong, Cap? Drake asked. Lionel rubbed his forehead. I didn't have time to make us any cool uniforms. Lionel's 8 brothers looked toward one another speechlessly for a moment before bursting into a fit of laughter. Raj wrapped his arm around Lionel's shoulder and trudged forward with big strides. Cap, if you can make me a uniform that makes the ladies realize that this is the true peak masculine form, I'll get Milan to give you a foot rub. Raj's big belly rolled with his laughter. As far as he was concerned, clothing designers were the real people screwing him over. The group walked out laughing, seemingly not realizing that they had a tall task ahead of them. They appeared on a barren moon to stare down at a planet, or at the very least, it was what should have been a planet, but was instead a temple the size of one. This place was none other than the headquarters of the Zoltene faith. According to reports, this faith had recently been making an aggressive push in Earth's territory, forcefully seizing offerings and spreading their shrines even in areas where there was no consent on the part of the inhabitants. Lionel could see the various clergymen of the Zoltene faith walking around. They all wore robes that flickered with holographic images that changed depending on the angle you saw them at. There didn't seem to be any rhyme or reason to the flickering colors, although there was probably some mysterious ranking system associated with it. Still, the most prominent part were the large glass orbs they wore like head ornaments. It seemed to be blown with different colored pieces of glass, flickering with a rainbow-like assortment of colors. More than their odd robes, this was the true marker of a worshipper of the Zoltene god. Let's go, Lionel said after observing for a while. With a leap, he shot forward on his black surfboard, streaking through the skies with his brothers to his back with their own flying treasures. Halt. This is the territory of the glorious Zoltene. Halt. Stop. The 9 brothers didn't seem to hear any of this in the slightest as they directly barged in, their speed even faster than usual. Chapter 1774. Published at 14th of April 2023 11:29 and 36 seconds AM. Chapter 1774. If audio player doesn't work, Press stop then play button again. Chapter 1774. So was Lionel. Powerful warriors converged from all sides. However, Lionel didn't lift a single finger. It was Drake who suddenly flipped over his palms, causing 2 silver pistols to appear. Without waiting for any signal, he began to fire. With every pull of his trigger, another clergyman was shot out of the skies. Although he didn't immediately kill any of them, they found themselves crippled at best, some of them even being shoved toward death's door. The group crossed the barrier of the temple, entering the highest floor directly. There should have been force art protections, but Lionel and the others seemed to slip right through them as though they didn't exist in the slightest, one after another. They landed on the marbled floors, kicking up their surfboards and following behind Lionel as he walked forward, despite having never been here before. It felt as though Lionel knew it like the back of his hand. Gliding forward toward the grand hall without a single pause in his steps, bang! A sparkling black pillar appeared in Raja's hand, which he used to ram against the enormous double doors, slamming against it so hard that they flew off of their hinges, slamming into the sides of the hall with a bang so loud that it echoed through the entire temple. Raj hoisted his large pillar over his shoulder and led the charge into the grand hall. At that moment, there were tens of thousands of clergymen kneeling on prayer mats, bowing in worship to the stature of a several kilometers tall of a person Lionel could only conclude had to be Zoltine. Zoltine's glass orbs looked a lot more like a radiant halo that, instead of being parallel to the ground, was actually perpendicular with it. Hovering behind his head, he had hands but on a single pair of arms. The other 2 pairs hovering in the air in mock prayer along with his only seemingly real pair of hands, at his forehead. There was a glass orb embedded that seemed to reflect the world of his ethereal glabella. Within it, a world of rainbow glass could be seen, exuding an air of peace and majesty, despite his usual thoughts on such matters. Lionel had to admit that this Zoltine at least looked like a god. But those extra hands, P Alpha D Alpha, no one. Lionel had read about such a race. They also had glass orbs in their forehead and extra hands that seemed completely separate from their bodies. They were known as a nomad race. Lionel's gaze narrowed. Even the Void Palace didn't have in-depth information on faiths and their gods. But these gods had to come from somewhere. So there were a number of working hypotheses. Some assumed that these were heroes of the past, much like echoes through history making their mark on today. Some assumed that it was the direct opposite, and they were instead powerhouses of the past influencing the past and leaving their mark. And for some others, they assumed that they were present heroes spreading word of their prowess. These faiths were likely related to the God path in some way or another, or at the very least, some divergent path of it. The reason the God path was denoted as such was precisely because of the influence it could have on its environment when taken to an extreme. And these seemed to be related to what these religions could accomplish. At that moment, a clergyman stood from beneath the statue of Zoltine, and then another, and then another. They all had robes rippling with rainbow colors and glass orbs hovering above and behind their heads that were a size larger than everyone else. Their gazes locked onto Lionel and the others, their expressions flooded with fury. Lionel walked forward slowly, his gaze locked onto clergyman. Who are you? The clergyman who spoke was the current head of the Zoltine faith within Earth's territory, a tall man who went by Impreza. This didn't seem to be a name, but more so a title, likely one unique to their faith. Do you not recognize the prince of the territory you're terrorizing? Lionel asked coolly. They'll give you 2 choices, Impreza. Take your faith, your clergyman, and what offerings you've managed to scrounge up and scram out of my territory, or, we can start a massacre. Which will it be? The Impreza's expression turned malevolent. However, when it settled in that Lionel was a prince of the Ascension Empire, he didn't seem to want to lash out immediately, as though he was still looking for a method out of this. Is this appropriate? You still haven't stated what we've done wrong? Does the prince of the empire not welcome religions? Aren't you afraid that the hearts of the people will grow cold? So you're aware that this is an empire too, right? Not a democracy. Do I need to explain to you why I do the things I do? The recently calmed expression of the Impreza turned ugly. It was clear that Lionel had no intention of negotiating with them. They hadn't expected to run into someone like this. While it was true that an empire wasn't a democracy, they still had to keep the people and their thoughts in mind. An empire that did and acted as they pleased wouldn't last very long. If you didn't care for the thoughts of the people, you would be overthrown. This should have been an opportunity to expand recklessly. With Earth surrounded by problems from all sides, there was no way they should be able to react like this without worrying about the consequences. The Imperza suddenly calmed, staring toward Lionel deeply. Fine, we will retreat. The glorious Zoltine cannot withstand the loss of even one son or daughter. You will face retribution for your actions today. The Imperza pressed his hands together. Lionel smiled, however deep within, he knew what the true intentions of the Imperza was. They would retreat for now and wait for an opportunity to come back when the Ascension Empire would have no choice but to accept them. Indeed, this Imperza was quite intelligent. But so was Lionel. Chapter 1775. Published at 14th of April 2023 11:29 and 36 seconds AM. Chapter 1775. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1775. Power of Information. Esteemed Imperza. Is this really okay? Not long after Lionel and the others had left, the clergyman of the Zoltine faith couldn't help but say something. While the lower-ranking members didn't dare to speak, those who had been beneath Zoltine's statue alongside the Imperza couldn't hold it in any longer. We must have patience, the Imperza said lightly, his hands still pressed together. The faith of his gloriousness will be spread regardless of its obstacles. We will make a comeback in due time, but for now, it is best to take a step back. We can only say that we were unlucky. But this tribulation will be weathered by us. When we come out the other side, we will be stronger than ever. Although the Imperza didn't say it in so many, those that were intelligent understood. Soon, the Ascension Empire would be experiencing more pressure than they knew how to handle. When that time came and they chose to come back, they wouldn't even have the time to deal with them. After they reaffirmed their position in Earth's territory, there would be nothing the Ascension Empire could do. The seeds had already been sown. Imperza. Imperza. It had only been several minutes. But an attendant had already run into the prayer hall. Rushing forward with information, one must maintain a calm mind beneath the presence of his gloriousness. Mind yourself. The Imperza said lightly. Yes, yes. The young clergyman took deep breaths, but eventually wasn't patient enough to wait until they had calmed down completely. Shrine, the shrines, the branch shrines, destroyed, the Imperza's pupils constricted. How many? Before the Imperza could finish his question, another attendant rushed in with the same news. Then another. The Imperza's fists clenched beneath his robes. Many of those shrines were exceptionally well hidden. He had expected to lose some in the worst-case scenario. But by the time the fifth attendant rushed in, he realized that they had all been destroyed with a speed that didn't even feel like it made sense. It was as though Lionel could cover the whole Ascension Empire with a single hand, with their shrines destroyed. Even if they came back, it would take decades to build their network back up again. If that was the case, their comeback would be almost meaningless. They would have little to no momentum. And by the time they gathered some up again, whatever troubles the Ascension Empire might be facing just might be over. And in the worst case, even if the Ascension Empire fell, Earth's territory would be gobbled up by others and have nothing to do with them. At that point, even the Imperza couldn't quite keep his calm. Years ago, the Evergreen Faith lost their main shrine under mysterious circumstances. Due to this, the Zoltine Faith was able to overtake them in a lot of ways. But now, the situation had been reversed once again and the Evergreen Faith once more had a chance at claiming a monopoly on Earth's territory. Just as the Imperza was about to lose his cool entirely, the planet-sized temples suddenly trembled. Many were immediately thrown off their feet. The sound of battle reached their ears, and the Imperza's ugly expression finally set in. No matter how cool-headed he normally was, it was impossible for him to maintain it. His immediate assumption was that Lionel had made them begin a retreat sequence so that they couldn't react to the destruction of their shrines. Then he doubled back to finish off the job for good. This was a devious plot, one that was impossible to execute unless one had the ability to travel across Earth's territory in just a handful of seconds. Unless Lionel had already set up a team at each location. but if he had done that, then what would have been the point of allowing them to begin their escape sequence? The Imperza couldn't quite understand what was happening until there was suddenly a burst at the doors of the prayer hall once again, doors that had only just been fixed. But to the Imperza's shock, rather than it being Lionel's team, it was a group he had never expected to see at all. They all wore brown robes and had golden lotuses etched onto the backs formed out of human hands. These weren't Lionel's men, nor were they people of Earth. This was the Evergreen religion. The head clergyman of the Evergreen led the charge, her strides long and her brownish gold hair fluttering beneath her speed. Priestess Irotha, what is the meaning of this? The Imperza's voice boomed. Priestess Irotha's expression didn't change, her gorgeous features radiating with a holy light. However, deep within her brown eyes there was a hint of disgust and disdain that came from the depths of her soul. 30 years ago, when you all destroyed the main shrine of our Evergreen faith, did you think that such a day would come? This is nothing more than the cycle of karma, Priestess Irotha said lightly. The faith of Evergreen may not be the most powerful, but we are the most resilient. So long as there is but a single bud remaining within a ravaged land, we will grow once more. Her everlasting is immortal, and so shall we be. The Imperza's expression changed once again. Destroyed their main shrine? They had never done such a thing. Slander. The Imperza's fury threatened to bubble over, but he could already feel his power slipping away. With the destruction of so many shrines, how could he match up to Priestess Irotha? Irotha sneered, clearly not believing the Imperza. She waved her hand. Erase them. You're evil, Cap. I like it. Raj rolled in laughter, slapping Lionel's shoulder a few times. Lionel smiled. We have Raylion and the others to thank. These things are almost too easy to handle so long as we have enough information in our hands. Let's go and see what the Viola family is up to. In this regard, the Imperza was quite pitiful. It wasn't the Zoltine faith that had destroyed the main shrine of the Evergreen faith, but rather the Three-Finger cult. But it was all too easy to frame them when it was the Zoltine faith that had gained the most from their fall. Of course, this would put the Evergreen faith in line to become a problem of its own, but Lionel would focus on one problem at a time. At the very least, after being destroyed once, the Evergreen faith was far more reserved and cautious. Now, Lionel was entirely focused on the return of the Viola family. Years ago, Lionel's mother had told him that Richard had something in his possession that he would be very interested in, but so many things had happened that Lionel never got the chance to inquire about what exactly that meant. Now, it seems that his neglect had allowed a rebirth of a family that had already been dealt with. Of all the problems he had caused, this was probably the one that was the most directly his fault. But that was fine, he had destroyed them once, and he would do it again. Lionel alone was dangerous enough. Lionel with a vast net of information might not even need to raise a finger to destroy someone. You're tuning in to the Biyao's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.